Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti al 51esimo convegno promosso dall'Istituto I.S.E.O in collaborazione con l'Università degli Studi di Brescia. Come forse saprete, l'Istituto I.S.E.O è un ente non profit che sin dalla sua fondazione nel 98 si prefigge l'obiettivo di diffondere la cultura economica attraverso l'organizzazione di conferenze, seminari, lezioni e summer school. Grazie a un'idea del nostro fondatore Franco Modigliani e del nostro presidente Robert Solow, entrambi premi Nobel per l'Economia, il nostro istituto si è ritagliato una piccola fetta di notorietà nel mondo accademico internazionale con quella che oggi è un'iniziativa ormai affermata, la I.S.E.O Summer School. Si tratta di una scuola estiva che l'Istituto I.S.E.O promuove ogni anno alla fine di giugno. La formula prevede la partecipazione di alcuni fra i più brillanti studenti PhD, master, ricercatori, insomma giovani economisti che da tutto il mondo vengono ad I.S.E.O per discutere dell'attualità globale con relatori illustri, fra cui in primis i premi Nobel. Pensate che dalla prima edizione dell'I.S.E.O Summer School nel 2004 sino ad oggi il nostro istituto ha riunito sul Sebino quasi 1000 giovani ricercatori provenienti da 102 paesi e 355 facoltà di tutto il pianeta. Sono giovani che nel corso poi degli anni hanno acquisito ruoli rilevanti all'interno del loro paese. Tra i nostri ex alunni noi abbiamo il consigliere economico e presidente della Repubblica Ceca, componenti del board della Banca Centrale della Malesia. Abbiamo qui tra di noi oggi, fra questi giovani economisti della Banca Centrale delle Filippine, solo per citare alcuni dei tantissimi esempi di studenti che sono passati dall'I.S.E.O Summer School. I partecipanti quest'anno, siamo alla 15ª edizione, sono qui fra voi nel pubblico che oggi assiste alla conferenza, lì notate per la maglietta verde con la scritta I.S.E.O. A proposito di conferenze, quello di oggi è un incontro speciale. Nel 2018 si celebra infatti il centenario della nascita di Franco Modigliani, nostro fondatore. Franco è stato l'unico italiano a vincere il premio Nobel per l'Economia nel 1985, ebreo, ha trascorso gran parte della sua carriera negli Stati Uniti dove si è rifugiato per scappare alle persecuzioni razziali. È stato uno dei più apprezzati e amati professori dell'MIT di Boston. Insieme a Robert Solow, nostro presidente, e Paul Samuelson, ha formato il trio di economisti conosciuti come i moschettieri dell'MIT. Fra i suoi alunni, alcuni degli economisti più noti dei nostri tempi, primo fra tutti Mario Draghi, alla guida della BCE. Durante uno dei suoi molti viaggi in Italia, viaggi che faceva sempre in compagnia della moglie Serena, Modigliani decise di venire a I.S.E.O per visitare Montisola ed è da quel viaggio, da un incontro del tutto casuale fra quel professore celeberrimo e un gruppo di iseani e di bresciani, che nel 98, 20 anni fa, è nato l'Istituto I.S.E.O. Non potevamo non dedicare a Franco questa conferenza. Se oggi siamo qui è anche grazie ad una proficua collaborazione fra il nostro istituto e l'Università di Brescia, nella persona del rettore Maurizio Tira e del professor Roberto Savona, con cui da anni collaboriamo per offrire alla nostra città incontri e dibattiti di grande spessore. E chi invitare in un incontro dedicato a Modigliani se non alcuni dei suoi colleghi e alunni diventati oggi protagonisti della vita economica mondiale? Robert Merton, premio Nobel per l'Economia 1997, e Marco Pagano, docente dell'Università Federico II di Napoli, che di Franco sono stati alunni. Grazie, professor Pagano, per essere. E questa sarà la prima sessione. Nella seconda sessione, Robert Engel, premio Nobel per l'Economia 2003. E Gianni Amisano della Federal Reserve. Tra l'altro per Amisano è un ritorno a casa perché è stato un po' di anni qui all'Università di Brescia, no? In chiusura, un grande ringraziamento a tutti i sostenitori del nostro istituto che ci hanno permesso di organizzare questo incontro. Come sapete noi siamo una fondazione non profit e quindi senza l'aiuto di tanti amici non potremmo sviluppare i nostri programmi. E soprattutto un sincero e affettuoso ringraziamento a Franco Modigliani, senza il quale l'Istituto I.S.E.O oggi non esisterebbe. La parola per un breve saluto ai due main sponsor del convegno odierno, Pierluigi Streparava per la Fondazione Comunità Bresciana e poi Stefano Kuhn per UBI Banca. Prego.
Buongiorno a tutti. Non è senza emozione che prendo la parola, perché il consesso dei relatori e dei rappresentanti delle varie istituzioni che è presente mette suggestione, specialmente a uno che non è addetto ai lavori. Io faccio l'imprenditore e la finanza ci tocca da vicino, però siamo molto più vicini al mondo della produzione, perciò mi è difficile prendere la parola in questo contesto. Io oggi però sono qui in rappresentanza della Fondazione della Comunità Bresciana, è una fondazione onlus, è una fondazione, come del resto anche chi mi ha preceduto ha specificato, una fondazione senza spirito di lucro. Molti di voi si domanderanno cosa c'entra la Fondazione della Comunità Bresciana in questo contesto. Allora c'entra perché quando ci è stato presentato già lo scorso anno e abbiamo ripetuto quest'anno la possibilità di contribuire alla sponsorizzazione di un evento di questo genere, l'abbiamo subito sposata l'iniziativa e l'abbiamo riconfermata quest'anno, perché operando nel mondo della sussidiarietà uno dei temi che affrontiamo più spesso è quello dei giovani, perché credo che non ci sia mai sufficientemente presente quello che vuol dire il tema dei giovani in questo momento, non solo dal punto di vista economico ma anche dal punto di vista pratico. Noi siamo convinti di riuscire attraverso la nostra fondazione, per quel poco che ci compete, per quel poco che possiamo fare, a migliorare le aspettative dei nostri giovani. È chiaro che non abbiamo un settore specifico nel quale interveniamo. Pensate che la Fondazione della Comunità Bresciana ha un patrimonio di 20 milioni di euro e abbiamo appena presentato 15 giorni fa il nostro report annuale, operiamo in diversi svariati settori che vanno dal sociale alla formazione, alla cultura, ma alle volte è molto difficile per noi all'interno del nostro consiglio scegliere su quale mondo influire. Oggi le attività principali che ci trovano pronti ad intervenire nei limiti naturalmente delle disponibilità che abbiamo sono quelle che chiamiamo le operazioni che riguardano in genere il sociale, ma non trascuriamo assolutamente il mondo dei giovani attraverso la cultura, perché crediamo fortemente che la cultura nei giovani sia uno stadio necessario per la loro vita professionale di un domani. Non voglio continuare oltre perché c'è tanta attesa per i relatori che sono stati presentati e vi diamo un saluto a tutti a nome della Fondazione della Comunità Bresciana. Grazie.
Buongiorno a tutti. Gentili signori, io vi porto i saluti di UBI Banca a questo importante convegno, organizzato dall'Istituto I.S.E.O in collaborazione con il Dipartimento Economia e Management dell'Università degli Studi di Brescia, per ricordare a 100 anni dalla nascita la figura del premio Nobel Franco Modigliani, fondatore di questo ente nonché della collegata Summer School, scuola estiva dedicata ai migliori dottorandi al mondo, giusta quest'anno la 15ª edizione, con la quale UBI Banca collabora proficuamente da anni. Convinto keynesiano, Modigliani non mancò in ogni suo lavoro di spiegare perché in un'economia moderna, soprattutto in fase recessiva, necessiti di essere stabilizzata, usando appropriate politiche monetarie e fiscali di sostegno, distinguendosi in tal modo da monetaristi secondo i quali non vi è alcuna necessità effettiva di stabilizzare l'economia, perché a loro dire questa si ristabilizza da sola, rendendo inutile l'affido di tale responsabilità ai governi. Di certo il Nobel italiano si sarebbe fermamente opposto a un'arida visione contabile che di fatto ha improntato la recente politica economica dell'Unione monetaria e di quella che è stata di fatto, in seguito alla più disastrosa crisi che abbia mai interessato il mondo industrializzato moderno. In particolare Modigliani riteneva inaccettabile che i governi potessero sopportare livelli di disoccupazione di massa, mascherando la loro inerzia dietro il paravento di trattati o di moneta unica. Nella sua autobiografia scrive: «Sono in grado di dimostrare che esiste un modo per rendere la moneta unica compatibile con la piena occupazione». Il suo impegno non si limitò tuttavia allo studio dei comportamenti delle principali variabili di politica economica, quali il reddito, i salari, i risparmi, l'occupazione, ma abbracciò anche branche ancora poco conosciute negli anni '60, come l'econometria. In tale ambito prezioso fu il contributo offerto da Modigliani alle istituzioni monetarie e bancarie americane, anche italiane, ed in particolare a Banca d'Italia, quando l'allora governatore Guido Carli lo chiamò a collaborare alla formulazione del primo modello econometrico dell'economia italiana, primo passo per una pianificazione di lungo termine dello sviluppo del nostro Paese, realizzato con l'utilizzo di innovativi strumenti di previsione e affinamento delle tecniche statistiche per migliorarne l'affidabilità dei dati. Questa cooperazione crea un legame molto profondo tra la Banca d'Italia e il MIT, dove Modigliani era stato chiamato a insegnare nel 1962 e dove soggiorneranno e studieranno molti degli economisti del nostro istituto di vigilanza, da Fazio a Padoa-Schioppa, da Tarantelli a Mario Draghi. Vorrei concludere osservando che Modigliani fu anche un grande comunicatore, perché riteneva che i puri insegnamenti della teoria e della politica non sono sufficienti se viene a mancare il confronto anche dialettico con i protagonisti delle sorti dei paesi. In proposito affermava: «Occorre guardare fuori, riflettere sui modelli di successo, andare alla ricerca di forme e di collaborazione e di trasmissione della conoscenza, valorizzare il beneficio della prospettiva storica. Occorre soprattutto evitare di concentrare esclusivamente l'attenzione al nostro interno e di restare prigionieri di orizzonti temporali o spaziali troppo ristretti. Chi condivide la responsabilità di governo dell'economia e più in generale dell'istituzione degli affari pubblici deve andare al di là del proprio ciclo vitale, impegnandosi in nome delle generazioni future, approfondire la propria conoscenza di modelli alternativi». In questa prospettiva Franco Modigliani si sarebbe speso perché gli Stati, soprattutto quelli che vogliono dirsi moderni e quindi sociali, si facessero carico di trovare i giusti strumenti per avvicinare i giovani al lavoro, particolarmente in un periodo di crisi di lungo corso come quello che stiamo attraversando, attivando le cosiddette politiche attive che maggiormente possono fare dei giovani il fiore all'occhiello del rilancio del lavoro dell'economia a livello nazionale. Vi ringrazio per l'attenzione.
Grazie a Pierluigi Streparava e Stefano Kuhn. E ora cominciamo ufficialmente il nostro convegno con un'introduzione da parte del padrone di casa, il rettore dell'Università di Brescia, il professor Maurizio Tira. Prego.
Buongiorno a tutti. No, non un'introduzione al convegno, non sono in grado, sono solo il rettore dell'università, ma non un onnisciente. Voglio solo dire tre cose. La prima, un grande ringraziamento all'Istituto I.S.E.O, al dottor Venchiarutti, a tutti gli amici dell'Istituto, perché con Roberto Savona condividiamo, posso dire, anche una certa invidia per la grandissima capacità che hanno avuto in questi 20 anni di portare a I.S.E.O e quindi nel bresciano, nel nostro territorio, così tanti giovani promettenti che si affrontano e imparano dalle persone più importanti nel mondo i temi dell'economia. Quando sono diventato rettore ho immediatamente cercato di intercettare questo percorso, perché credo insopportabile per l'Università degli Studi di Brescia non intersecare un'attività così virtuosa. E sono grato al dottor Venchiarutti che ci ha consentito di poter organizzare insieme queste iniziative. Quindi una volontà che esprimo qui davanti a voi tutti di poter andare avanti con questa collaborazione e intensificarla. Il secondo punto, se vi consentite, è su Franco Modigliani dal punto di vista dello studioso. È stata una persona che, come abbiamo sentito già, ha dovuto lasciare questo Paese a seguito dell'emanazione delle leggi razziali, 80 anni fa, le leggi. E noi come sistema universitario, al tempo, abbiamo avuto anche una certa responsabilità. Sono stati parecchi professori che hanno dovuto lasciare questo Paese e sono lieto di annunciare qui che il 20 settembre il sistema universitario italiano celebrerà un giorno della richiesta di perdono alla comunità scientifica internazionale a Pisa, proprio ricordando le persone che hanno dovuto andarsene in seguito alle leggi razziali. Credo sia un gesto doveroso, soprattutto in un Paese dove incredibilmente si ricominciano a sentire alcuni discorsi assurdi. Il terzo pensiero è agli studenti che frequentano la Summer School e a tutti gli studenti dell'Università di Brescia. È un grande benvenuto perché oggi le comunità universitarie, attraverso anche questa esperienza di internazionalizzazione, credo che dimostrino al mondo intero, io sono molto lieto di appartenere alla comunità universitaria, dimostrino al mondo intero che è possibile creare delle comunità di relazioni umane, perché la Summer School credo che sia anche questo, che non hanno nessun tipo di barriera, né barriere culturali, né barriere razziali, né barriere di appartenenza a ciascun paese, né barriere di censo, e quindi questo credo che sia un piccolo insegnamento che la comunità universitaria dovrebbe travasare nell'organizzazione della società. Grazie ancora, io non sono in grado, sono un ingegnere civile e ambientale, quindi non sono in grado di dire niente di sensato sul tema economico. Il professor Savona rappresenta egregiamente il nostro Ateneo in questo frangente. Buona mattinata di lavoro a tutti e arrivederci un'altra volta a Brescia per tutti quelli che non sono di Brescia.
Bene, prima di iniziare i lavori vorremmo mostrarvi un contributo video di pochissimi minuti. Oggi a rendere omaggio a Franco avrebbero voluto essere in molti. Professori, uomini di governo, colleghi, amici che hanno in qualche modo avuto a che fare con lui. Abbiamo dunque selezionato alcuni dei messaggi che ci sono arrivati da volti noti dell'economia globale, dei governi di mezzo mondo, creando un piccolo video tributo per il nostro fondatore. Possiamo vederlo insieme.
I am Robert Schiller. I got my PhD in 1972 with Franco Modigliani as my advisor and later co-author. I think Franco was a real guide star to my life. I'm thinking he showed me that economics is really connected to the real world and not just a bunch of jargon and mathematical theorems. But maybe even more important, what I got from Franco was a real moral purpose, and that underlying it all, economics is really about caring for other people.
It is difficult to overstate how much I owe to Franco. I think the best way to say it is the whole lot. Franco, in many ways, is the macroeconomist who has inspired me the most, not just because of his scientific contributions, but because of the way he went at research. If I had to summarize the implicit message that I got from him is, first, work on central macro issues. Second is develop a theoretical frame, and he's well known for having developed really important ones. Third, go to the data with great care, much more so than a typical theorist would actually do. Fourth, draw policy implications. Then, fifth, fight for them. Engage those who disagree in detailed and constructive criticism, and Franco was involved in many such debates, but it was always about the data and the truth. Then engage policymakers and never give up until you've convinced them. So, in short, I think the message I get from Franco is that research is not an intellectual game. It's science at the service of humankind. It's a mission. It's a passion. It could be quite exhausting to be close to him, especially when he lived about 100 yards from my house, and he had ideas in the middle of the night which he wanted to share urgently. But on that, I loved it, and I'm very thankful for the interactions that we had over many, many years. Thank you.
Not difficult job to talk about Modigliani as a scientist. He was a great scientist, a great economist. I want only to remember how he was open, friendly, and humble in the personal relations. You know, he was always a teacher, a maestro in the real sense of the word. We wrote some article together for an Italian daily. And I was a young guy. He was a great guy, and he was so open. He was putting you in the most easy condition that you could imagine. So I should never forget the humanity of Franco.
Franco Modigliani was a close friend. And we even wrote a manifesto with several other economists on European illnesses. And we were on the same track. European illnesses is partly the consequence that we have forgotten demand. We are in a totally asymmetric country, and also because there is no centralization of economic policy and the reform, for example, of a fiscal authority. He participates to something. He took it seriously and did it well. Grazie Franco.
Bene, e prima di passare la parola al professor Savona che coordinerà i nostri lavori, vi voglio leggere un messaggio che ci è giunto proprio questa mattina dal Presidente della Repubblica Sergio Mattarella. Il 51esimo Convegno di Studi internazionali dedicato all'eredità di Franco Modigliani nell'Economia globale si svolge nel centenario della nascita dell'illustre economista, fecondo autore di teorie sul risparmio e la crescita. Colpito dalle infami leggi razziali nel vortice della guerra, si trasferisce prima a Parigi, poi a New York, restando fortemente legato all'Italia, con cui manterrà un vitale rapporto scientifico e intellettuale, maestro e guida per molte generazioni di economisti del nostro Paese. Dotato di straordinaria capacità analitica, animato da profonda passione civile, il grande economista e ideatore della teoria del ciclo vitale del risparmio che gli valse nel 1985 il premio Nobel, ha affrontato con acutezza e lungimiranza i temi del risanamento pubblico, delle pensioni, della lotta alla disoccupazione, della partecipazione italiana al processo di integrazione economica europea. Modigliani, come testimonia nella sua autobiografia e come ha anticipato prima il rettore, ebbe sempre chiarissimo che l'obiettivo di un'economia sana resta la piena occupazione. Scrive: sono indignato dell'infamia di una disoccupazione di massa che non viene affrontata con sufficiente energia dai governi. Non è nemmeno vero che l'obiettivo della piena occupazione affrontato come priorità assoluta avrebbe come conseguenza quella di mettere in soffitta il Trattato di Maastricht e la moneta unica. Sono in grado di dimostrare che esiste un modo per rendere la moneta unica compatibile con la piena occupazione. Il patrimonio di conoscenze scientifiche e di virtù civili che egli ci ha trasmesso testimonia la perdurante vitalità dei suoi insegnamenti che hanno favorito la crescita e la trasformazione del sistema economico italiano e rivoluzionato la finanza moderna. Rivolgo infine un apprezzamento a tutti coloro che hanno collaborato a questa importante iniziativa e in particolare all'Istituto I.S.E.O per l'appassionata dedizione e il contributo di assoluto rilievo nell'approfondimento degli studi legati alla figura di Franco Modigliani e rivolgo a tutti i partecipanti un augurio di buon lavoro. Firmato Sergio Mattarella.
Buongiorno a tutti. Per me è un grandissimo privilegio poter coordinare i lavori di questo convegno dedicato all'opera, ma direi soprattutto al lascito scientifico di Franco Modigliani. Un'occasione, è stato detto più volte, unica non solo per il nostro Ateneo, ma credo anche per la nostra città. Quando abbiamo iniziato a pensare a come strutturare questo importante appuntamento, ci siamo subito accorti che discutere dei numerosi contributi del grande economista che ha potuto offrire lungo la sua lunga carriera di studioso, pensatore, ma anche educatore, come abbiamo sentito dalle testimonianze dirette, come sentiremo anche da chi è stato suo allievo, sarebbe stato francamente impossibile, soprattutto in una mattinata. Quindi abbiamo deciso di articolare il convegno in 2 sessioni, nelle quali riprendere alcuni dei più noti studi, contributi di Franco Modigliani, reinterpretandoli alla luce degli sviluppi che la teoria economica e finanziaria ha saputo offrire grazie al suo pensiero, un pensiero che su diverse tematiche è stato un pensiero, come dire, visionario ma anche anticipatore. Non solo pensiamo al problema della sostenibilità della spesa pensionistica, ma ricordo degli ultimi interventi pubblici, toccò anche l'argomento oggi molto problematico della sostenibilità della spesa sanitaria ed anche dell'istruzione. Il panel, come abbiamo sentito, include 4 speaker straordinari, 2 premi Nobel e 2 economisti di fama internazionale. La prima sessione, adesso entriamo nel vivo dei lavori, vede Robert Merton, premio Nobel per l'economia 1997, e Marco Pagano, che è professore di economia degli intermediari finanziari nell'Università di Napoli Federico II. I temi che affronteranno i 2 economisti, come dicevo entrambi allievi di Modigliani, partono da uno dei contributi più noti dell'economia finanziaria, il teorema di Modigliani-Miller, sulle scelte di finanziamento delle imprese, ma anche sull'impatto teorico, metodologico, per certi versi anche filosofico che tale teorema ha potuto offrire sugli studi di finanza in senso lato, non quindi limitandoci esclusivamente alla finanza aziendale. Altro argomento che sarà affrontato attiene ai fondamentali contributi di Franco Modigliani sullo studio delle dinamiche relative alle scelte tra risparmio e consumo lungo l'intero ciclo di vita di un individuo e anche a livello aggregato di un paese, e in particolare esaminandone le implicazioni in termini di finanziamento della spesa pensionistica. E veniamo quindi al primo speaker, Robert Merton, professore di finanza all'MIT di Boston e professore emerito alla Harvard University. Insieme a Marion Schulz è stato insignito del premio Nobel per l'economia del 1997, per lo sviluppo, leggo testualmente, di una nuova metodologia di valutazione degli strumenti derivati. L'estensione del metodo di analisi ha toccato anche successivamente altri strumenti finanziari e inoltre permesso di meglio comprendere e misurare e prevedere le dinamiche dei rischi finanziari a livello sistemico, con ciò offrendo un approccio scientifico ma anche pragmatico operativo per lo sviluppo di tecniche di risk management, soprattutto nel settore dell'industria finanziaria. Signore e signori, Robert Merton. Please.
I'm putting my watch up here because, as you know, professors love to talk. And among professors, I'm known as a talker. So we have to impose extreme discipline, and I count on our chairman to ensure that I behave. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here this morning to celebrate Franco. Franco Modigliani's ecumenical contributions to economics and his diversified influence on the world have led economists in just about every sector of economics to claim him as their own. A sampling of ceremonial presidencies he held will make the point. He was president of the American Economics Association. He was a president of the Econometric Society. He was president of the American Finance Association and honorary president of the International Economics Association. An array of presidencies that no one else other than Franco has accomplished. It is, of course, natural here in the land of his birth that Franco would be seen as the great Italian economist, honored by the government, knighted by the government for his important theoretical contributions and for his sage advice in policy. On the other hand, from my country, his homeland for 65 years, he is known as the great American economist. However, strictly, there's only one truly accurate geocognitive descriptor of Modigliani, Franco Modigliani, the great world economist. Now, with that said, I will shamelessly concentrate on his contributions to my special field of economics, finance. As was mentioned in the opening remarks, he received the Nobel Prize, certainly a world recognition, for his work on the life cycle of saving and for his work with Merton Miller on corporate finance. Both of these influenced the field of finance in a dramatic and permanent way. Now, in the Modigliani-Miller Theorem, and I'm not going to turn this into a seminar. If we do that, we'll be here for 2 days, if we each do that. It was simply to say that when he looked at corporate finance at the time, he and Merton Miller, in fact, they were asked to teach it. And when they started to teach it, they realized what was the stream of thought at the time did not make any sense to them. So they sat down to try to straighten it out, applying rigorous analytical skills for which he became known throughout his career, at the same time with the practicality of how these might affect actual practice. And what they proved in a series of theorems was very contrary to the thinking of the time, namely that essentially under specialized conditions, idealized conditions, no transaction costs, no bankruptcies, no agency costs, and so forth. But in that kind of an environment, given the investment policy of the firm, how the firm was financed, whether with debt or equity and how much of each, didn't matter to the value of the firm. And furthermore, what was viewed at the time as the most important policies of the firm, which was what was their dividend policy, because they knew empirically, believe this or not, empirically they had shown that $1 increase in dividends improved the stock price 4 times more than $1 increase in retained earnings. So from a practical point of view, it was extremely important, dividend policy, and appropriately that of the board, the most senior decision makers for the firm. They showed that neither of them, under the conditions I've described, would have any impact on value. The response to this, as was often the case with Franco's work, as Franco would put it, it's absolutely crazy. Could not be. So much was devoted to the financing and dividend policies. How could this be? And as a practitioner, we knew it didn't describe the real world. But because of the rigorous analytical development of the theorems, using probably the most robust principle in economics, which is the absence of arbitrage in markets, by applying that, they demonstrated in very clear and in that sense simple way that the proposition was correct. After people went through that very rigorous derivation, it flipped over and it turned into, oh, it's absolutely obvious. Obviously not an important contribution. So you see, that was always true with Franco. In fact, when he won the Nobel Prize and they were trying to describe in the New York Times why he got it, I won't describe the life cycle, I'll leave that to someone else, but when it came to explaining the corporate finance theorems, he said he got the prize for saying that if you had a pizza this size and you sliced it in 4 slices or 8 slices, the total size of the pizza remained unchanged. Wow, I wish I'd thought of that. Well, the impact, his legacy from this work has been really, it continues 60 years later to this day. And let me just frame it a little bit for you. There was a mention here that Franco thought of this as a science. And yes, finance is a science. It has strong principles and theories, hypotheses. It now has an extraordinary amount of data for which to subject these hypotheses to rigorous study. It is definitely a science. And I believe somewhere between 8 and 10 people received Nobel Prizes for work related to finance since Franco's time. But if you go back to the time that Modigliani was doing his work, finance was not really a science. It had very little, if any, data. It had a lot of anecdotes, accounting identities, and rules of thumb by which corporate finance and the rest of finance was described. In the 1950s and the 60s, when finance became a science, Franco, along with Harry Markowitz, James Tobin, Ken Arrow, Bill Sharp, and so forth, Paul Samuelson and Gene Fama, transformed this hodgepodge of unorganized and untested thinking to a science. And the Modigliani-Miller theorems still stand today as a cornerstone of the beginning and understanding of what corporate finance is about. So the legacy there is to the science is unmistakable. Now, when Franco, I think the other element that I would say is that in the 1970s, I will again alluded to in some of this related to my own work, we developed, building on Modigliani-Miller, that the firm is the unit that matters, not the pieces. They used to build it up. Debt should earn this rate, equity should earn that rate, and they build it up to the pieces, and then they got the firm. Modigliani had to see that it was the firm that mattered, the investments that mattered, and that all the other pieces were derivative, that they were really how you sliced up the outcomes of the firm and shared them, shared the risk and shared the rewards. But that you couldn't understand any one of the pieces without understanding the whole linked to one another. And this led to, among other things, a unified theory for a capital structure, a whole different way of not only thinking about finance, but many other parts of economics. So indeed, this is a theory that is still taught today, is foundational, and is at the core of much of what modern finance is. And indeed, Modigliani can take responsibility or, if you like, credit for having been a major contributor. The other part of his Nobel Prize, which will be discussed, I think, in the other sessions and more thoroughly, is his life cycle hypothesis of saving. And first I would mention, I don't know whether it will get mentioned today, but I want it mentioned just once. In 1944, Franco was 26. He published a very famous paper in macroeconomics. It's Liquidity Preference and the Theory of Interest in Money. This was a mathematical rendition of the then Keynesian model, and many believe it is the best mathematical description of Keynes's theory out there. And in that, of course, as in all of Keynes at that time, thinking about consumption and saving, was a very static model. Current income determined consumption and therefore saving, statically. When Franco introduced the life cycle hypothesis, he looked and saw that what it was would matter over the entire lifetime of the individual, should be considered in understanding behavior at the time. And therefore, it was not just current income or current conditions in that respect that mattered, but all of what the future could bring in terms of both income to the individual and future consumption, and that in itself would drive the decision as to how much to consume and therefore how much to save today. And that making consumption dependent on wealth changed the predictions that you would get from the standard static model in response to income. And at least at the time, I think pretty much was consistent with the empirical observations. And so it provided a very different view as to what was there, even at a time where Keynes was still relatively new, and he was already moving on to the next level. How does that fit in finance? Well, of course, finance is all about uncertainty and intertemporal optimization, especially over long periods. And so the life cycle hypothesis is critical there. Where it had its biggest impact on practice directly, again was alluded to in the opening remarks, is Franco's interest and focus, especially in the latter part of his lifetime, last 10 or 15 years, on retirement. That part of the life cycle phase where we're living, and we hope loving life, but we're no longer working. And how do we fund that? How do we think about that? And what do we do with that? The work he did culminated in a book called The Rethinking of Pension Reform with Arun Maralaidar, and it was published posthumously in 2004. Before I even say a further word, I think that book should be dusted off, and people dealing with this major global crisis in the funding of retirement should reread what he had to say in his prescriptions. Where did this life cycle fit into retirement? Well, number one, if you're designing a new or better retirement system, before you start to optimize or talk about investment strategies, first establish what is the objective. The objective is a good retirement. Well, that sounds nice. How do we convert the notion of a good retirement into something quantitative, analytical? At the core of all retirement systems, if you dig into them, is the idea that fundamentally a good retirement would be one where one could sustain the style or standard of living that you become used to in the latter part of your work life, whatever that may be, at this level, or at that level. We get used to how we live. And while we would all like to live better, I can promise you firsthand, from where I stand today, you're not going to want to live worse when you get older. that isn't the case. So the principle of almost all retirement system design is for a good retirement is to try to make it possible for people to sustain that standard of living throughout the rest of their life. If you do that, that's a good retirement. Well, where did that come from? This was exactly what Franco had to say. He said, during the work years, you don't want to live on dog food, so you could dine on crystal in retirement. And certainly during the work years, you didn't want to live in such a way that in retirement, you had to dine on dog food. The point was a balance. And that dynamic balance is quite critical in understand design and understand the risk of retirement systems. Instead of setting a fixed goal for retirement no matter what it says is, if you find that your fortunes are greater than expected, that's the wonderful good news. What's the unfortunate news that goes with it? In order to get your standard of living consistent with that higher level, you're going to have to save more. And on the other side, when you have bad fortune, it reduces your standard of living. One counterbalance to that is you don't have to quite save as much. So the dynamic embedded in the Modigliani life cycle hypothesis is central to proper definition and design, including the understanding of what is risky and what is not in the retirement design. Now, one of his motivations, as you heard from everyone, is Franco was passionate that economics should matter. And in the end, if we didn't have our science impact humanity, then we have completely failed. And so he took the first report on I told you I'd be provincial, on the U.S. Social Security system in 1999. It was pretty grim. It was the first time we really had taken stock of where we were in terms of our Social Security system. And the result was we're going to run out of money to fund by 2042. That was in 1999. Perhaps someone can help me. I have only one slide for you. I couldn't resist sharing it with you. Could someone put it up for me? Anybody can do it, I think. Can you do it? I have to show. This is from the New Yorker in 1999. This was a favorite cartoon of Franco. So I'm just simply the messenger here. This isn't my cartoon. This is Franco's. Father, thank you. If you can see here, given the report on where the Social Security was and we were going to run out of money, you have an abandoned person on a desert island being saved, sounding out, "Forget me, save Social Security." And that in one picture put Franco's priorities in perspective. And that's why he dedicated so much. Now, he showed that pay-as-you-go systems, those are systems like traditional Social Security where you just pay for current benefits by current contributions and hope that at the end that will continue. He showed analytically that that was a highly unstable system for the amount of contributions, very sensitive to demographics, very sensitive to productivity and growth, very sensitive to longevity. Does this sound familiar to people in the room? I mean for today. Absolutely. These are the factors. And in a pay-as-you-go system, relatively modest changes in those parameters produce great variation in the amount of contributions to sustain it. And taking that in hand, he came in and designed a combination for a retirement system, which involved stabilization of the income to some degrees, but a recognition that we had to make adjustments in the amount of contributions in order to fund it, and perhaps, under some conditions, changes in benefits in some sort of balance to keep the system going. And he had some very interesting financial engineering that he did. His idea was that the contributions would go to Social Security Fund, that fund would invest them, and not just invest them in government bonds, but invest them prudently in certain amount of risk assets, knowing full well what risk meant. Risk means that you could do worse as well as better. But with the higher expected returns, use this to make it more feasible, more efficient in delivering on the promise long term. But he recognized the importance to so many people and their dependency on the retirement system and their limits on how much risk they could take. So what he did was arrange what we call a total return swap. If you don't know what that is, look it up. There are hundreds of trillions of dollars of swaps sloshing around the world today. But at the time, he wanted Treasury, that's the general fundraiser and responsibility for the government sector, to swap with the Social Security Fund, where the risky returns went to Treasury and a safe set of real returns went to the participants. So he was able to get within the system the benefits of the risk-return trade-off, recognizing fully risk, at the same time to create a system that had appropriate safety for the individual in their own life cycle experience. I won't go through all the others, but I point this out as the kind of very practical and important innovations, some of which have been implemented and some that I hope to see be implemented as we address the crisis of today. He also, in the area of retirement, developed performance fees measurement. In other words, for the management of funds, you have to have people manage them. He devised systems for performance fees, which are commonplace now, but were unheard of at the time, back in 1975. All of that to sustain and improve the retirement system. So in all of these innovations, he's had a profound impact, and it will continue. Oh, I hate to mention it. We just had another Social Security update. Remember I mentioned with the picture 1999. This is 2018. How are we doing? Remember 1999, 2042? You know what the date is now? 2034. 8 years earlier than he thought. And Franco was upset, properly so, at 2042 in 1999. So, like many of the things in the world, whether it's global warming or whatever is your favorite, this is real and is coming. And if nothing is done, it will be very serious, and it gets worse. That's the bad news. What's the good news? The good news is that we can fix it. In my view, and I've been working in this area a long time, this is a complex problem, a difficult problem, but it's not a science problem, it's an engineering problem. We know how to fix it. We have the tools to fix it, but we have to execute. And if Franco was here, I'm sure he would be echoing that from every chamber around the earth. And so, again, we see the legacy of Modigliani in 2018 is hard and strong. Now, I'm looking and cognizant of the time, so I'll be a little careful. But those were the two that everybody thinks of, particularly because of the Nobel Prize citation. But I would be derelict if I did not mention some of his other important contributions in finance, but maybe into some other parts of economics as well. And that is his work on the term structure of interest rates, bond rates. He, with Richard Such, in 1966, a long time ago, published a paper on understanding the term structure of interest rates called the preferred habitat theory. The simple idea, in contrast to the base idea that all that affects bond prices for today are expectations of the future interest rates, he said there were preferred habitats that people or institutions like to invest in certain maturities or durations, and they would try to stick with them unless the cost became prohibitive. And that was a different element of effects. Now, Why did they have this? Well, Franco gave some ideas. But I can tell you what it is today, and I can give you a very concrete example of how perceptive this work is and relevant. We now understand, in investing, there are two things that investment people find boring. Diversification is a boring subject. They want to be able to do neat things of improving performance. The other is the risk-free asset. Nobody likes to talk about the risk-free asset. That's just boring. Until you realize there is not one risk-free asset, that the risk-free asset, being that asset which pays whatever your goal is, for sure, what else could be risk-free, depends on your goal. And therefore, there are an uncountable number of risk-free assets. And you cannot define a risk-free asset without the context of what it's being used for. What was the objective of the portfolio? Case in point, for older people, those of us nearing or in retirement, the safest thing for us is a stream of income assured every month for the rest of our life. Why? Because of the standard of living. Remember the Modigliani life cycle? A standard of living is defined by income, not by wealth. And so it's the income that matters. And all Social Security systems, with the exception of DC systems, have always recognized that. They don't tell you you have a pot of money at the Social Security. They tell you you have some income benefits. Okay? So a safe asset for us old folk is a long-term bond that pays us a stream of income, ideally protected for inflation. What happens to the price of that bond as interest rates change, even a little? They vary greatly. So while it is absolutely safe in terms of income, which is what matters to us older folk, it is very risky for those who measure their wealth and the stability of their wealth as that. So you young people with lots of human capital aren't worried about a stream of income being assured, not at this time. We old ones do. So your risk-free asset may be to pay for your child's education in 6 months or the tax bill in 1 year. So your safe asset is a very short-term treasury bill, the more traditional. Mine is a long-term bond, very different in risk. I have a habitat, or what looks like a habitat, for long bonds. Not because it's just my preferences, it's because what's risk-free for me is that particular maturity bond. What's risk-free for you young folk is very different. It's a short-term treasury. That differential, which is fundamental and makes the risk-free asset actually a fairly complex and important thing to understand, was embedded in Franco's term structure preferred habitat 52 years ago. So you see, this is something we talk about today, and he contributed to it half century later. Okay? Other. I'm going to call attention to just one other paper of his done with Emil Grunberg on prediction of social events when the prediction itself affects the possibility of events occurring. So the fact that there's a prediction of what's going to happen actually influences the likelihood that will happen. A version of that is the self-fulfilling prophecy. I have special attention to that since my father is the one who invented that idea. But this was separate and different, done somewhat after. And people at the time said, well, that's what the problem is. If you have predictions affecting outcomes, you can never predict accurately, because you predict it, then you change things. Your prediction changes it. How will it ever work? Hopeless. Franco, using his analytical skills, attacked the problem and actually analyzed it, much like he did with Merton Miller in corporate finance. went back to basic principles and said, let's really try to understand it, not just listen to the chatter of law. And when he did, he was able to develop a model which took account of the fact that when you made a prediction, it would change the outcome, and look at that whole mechanism and then look for what we call technically a fixed point, a point at which the prediction, when you go through all of the facts, ended up being what was the outcome. And he thus was able to analytically, mathematically prove that such could be done and showed how it could be done. And I think those of you who have read and studied and seen the theory of rational expectations from Muth through Lucas and others will see, in effect, this was an early and fundamental contribution to that part of economics, and particularly to finance. So, if we look at Franco's body of research, he has had at least 150 papers, maybe closer to 180. I've lost count. Depends when you look. I think he's still writing them from somewhere and sending them down to us to give his share. But I would point out to you, which is the fashion today with our computers and databases, we measure people's impact by citations. In other words, we don't just look at the number of publications, but how often do anyone use your work? Those are citations, and that's become the norm. To have impact, you have lots of citations. I want to let you in on something if you haven't thought about it. There's even a higher level of impact that is measured not by citations, because what happens is when your work is so fundamental, so often referred to, you no longer bother to put the citation in the references. When you say Shakespeare's Hamlet, you don't see people then putting in the biography, William Shakespeare, 15 whatever, Hamlet. We all know that, and we don't bother to reference it. Just so with Modigliani's and Miller's corporate finance theorems, just so with Modigliani's life cycle. So he is elevated to a level which we call technically obliteration by incorporation in canonical knowledge. Modigliani's work is part of canonical knowledge, and so no point in trying to measure his citations against the rest of us mere mortals. So I thought I would just do it. The factor of Franco's work is that it was always rigor and always relevance. If it didn't have implications for society, for our better understanding and managing of resources, he wasn't interested. He set the tone for modern finance that began as a science in the 1950s and 60s, and modern finance which, through a series of events actually involving rather substantial crisis in the 1970s, brought finance science together with finance practice in a way that no other branch of economics does, no disrespect. But the highest level theory, the highest level empirical work in the science are routinely incorporated into the mainstream practice of finance. And that's been going on for decades to the benefits of societies global. And I would do it there. Franco Modigliani was a great macroeconomist, and he was a great microeconomist. A few economists had that distinction. There are others. But the element that was unmistakably a Modigliani stamp, one that even among that rare group of both macro and microeconomists was Franco's, was his diligence to detail and the whole process. He would come up with the theory, but that wasn't good enough. Then he would collect the data and do the econometric work to test the theory. And then after he did that, he would then use these data and so forth to formulate policy. And then after that, he would go on and see if the policy was implemented, collect the data, and reconnect it and look at it. In corporate finance parlance, or strategic corporate finance parlance, he was a totally horizontally and integrated research system. He did it all, from the theory all the way through to the follow-up on the implication in policy. And that is a rare and treasured skill that affected his impact. And finally, and I've been looking at the time, so I think I'm still all right, according to, right? Okay, okay. I've been talking about his legacy as others, and his importance and impact, not at the time only, but today. I want to talk now about a more personal legacy. A legacy for those who, like me, had the great good fortune to be both a student and a colleague of Franco. And in that light, for those students and colleagues of Franco, I want to recall some observations on the man and what it was like to be in that role. So I have a list here, if you'll permit me. Here's what each generation of colleague and student passed on to the next about Franco. Expect fast-paced and well-founded speech. Where enthusiasm undertaken him, he ignored the bureaucratically defined 90-minute lecture and would continue on. That was Franco. Write your thesis under Franco's direction and expect to double the amount of the time it takes to complete it. He could always think of one more thing you could do with the data, one more thing you could do to improve it. Those students out there, whenever you're feeling leaned on, think of that. You thought it was over, but it wasn't. Just the beginning. Thesis writers, be prepared to convince your spouse that the late night phone calls and weekend sessions were truly with Franco. Recognize that Franco's econometric techniques provided, let's say, an emphasis on substance other than form. Those who know his econometrics know what I mean. I'll even share one. Stan Fisher, who he and I were in Franco's class together, used to say, isn't it a shame that Franco has to spend all of his time torturing the data in the models to get the results that he knew were true? We just wanted to put him in a box, like an old-fashioned cardboard box. Put your question in the box. Franco would tell us the answer, it would come out, be both more efficient and more accurate. Now, Franco's, he also said that to be the beneficiary of his deeply critical and affectionate concern with every one of his students. He was just a good person. And he had really, really cared about society, but he also cared about every individual. He was a gentle man. So, as with students, with colleagues, one fundamental rule that we all had, we knew, if you gave a seminar and you're at the board, Franco, sitting always in the front, would leap up and say, that's wrong, let me show you. And he would come to the board. What you knew is never, but never yield the chalk to Franco. Because once he had it, you're done. It was the rest of the session. So thank you for letting me share a few of these. I will finally close by saying, in 1985, the summer, before he had the great news from Stockholm, there was supposed to be a great meeting of Italian economists and American economists together to celebrate Franco. It was to be held here in Rome. However, conditions were such that it was decided to move it to the United States, Martha's Vineyard, where Franco had a place. And that was, the Italians among it were very happy with that. We from the US would have preferred to come to Rome. But we went to Martha's Vineyard, and let me just tell you the process. There were 12 papers prepared. The conditions at the conference were quite clear. The presenter of the paper got 12 minutes. The discussions of the paper got 5 minutes. And after each paper, Franco was given unlimited amount of time to discuss the paper. We had a glorious 2 days. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll share in this thing.
Bene, il secondo speaker di questa prima sessione è Marco Pagano, professore di economia degli intermediari finanziari, come dicevamo prima, all'Università Napoli Federico II, presidente dell'Einaudi Institute for Economics and Finance e direttore del Center for Studies in Economics and Finance. Ha conseguito un PhD all'MIT di Boston, abbiamo già detto che è stato allievo di Franco Modigliani, e di recente ha vinto un grant, è sicuramente il grant più competitivo che c'è in Europa in tema di ricerca scientifica, l'I.S.E.O Advanced Grant, per un progetto su Finance and Labor. È stato consulente e membro di commissione del Ministero del Tesoro italiano e dal 2012 è stato presidente e vicepresidente dell'Advisory Board scientifico del Comitato Europeo per il Rischio Sistemico. Il titolo del suo intervento è Il teorema di Modigliani-Miller, una pietra miliare della finanza aziendale. Marco.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure for me, and I must say also a source of emotion, to stand in front of you and talk about Franco Modigliani and about his legacy. Franco was one of my teachers, and it has given me not only guidance, substantive guidance in research, in economics and finance, but also he gave me an example, a very bright example of how to do research in these fields. So for me it has been a very important source of inspiration throughout my life. I will talk here mostly about his contributions to finance, and in doing so I will inevitably go through some of the same ideas and concepts that so brilliantly and pleasantly actually Bob Merton has expounded. I hope you forgive me for this. So I will focus in particular, as the title of these slides say, on the Modigliani-Miller theorems, which were mentioned and discussed at the beginning by Bob Merton. And as he said already, these are really foundational in finance. They are a cornerstone of finance, and Franco was very well aware that the Modigliani-Miller theorems were a fundamental contribution. This is very hard to disagree with. Today, practically no course in corporate finance starts without explaining the Modigliani-Miller theorems. And these theorems have affected the entire development of research in our field. There are two reasons for this. One is a substantive reason, and one is a methodological reason. The substantive reason was already mentioned by Bob Merton before, and it is that these theorems provided a crystal clear benchmark case where capital structure decisions and dividend policy decisions, which are just about the two most important decisions in the life of a firm, are irrelevant. So they are neutrality propositions. I will say more for why this is such an important substantive contribution. But these theorems also had a methodological aspect which is extremely important, because Modigliani and Miller made their case using formalized reasoning, and particularly an arbitrage argument, which at the time in which they presented it was quite new. Let me first talk about the substantive side, so the benchmark value of these theorems. It was very surprising, as Bob Merton said before, at the time, to say that the key financial choices of the firm are irrelevant. as he said, many people thought this was crazy. That, you know, the choice, for instance, of the leverage of a firm would be inconsequential for its value. That the decision about how much of the profits of the firm to distribute as dividends would be inconsequential for the value of the firm. However, the virtue of these findings was not so much that it truly means that these are irrelevant decisions, but that these theorems force us to understand what actually makes these choices relevant. So essentially, in Miller's own words, which I think are very clear, the value of these theorems lie not so much in showing what doesn't matter, but in showing what, by implication, really matters. So essentially, these theorems force us to think about which of the assumptions on which these theorems rest must be actually violated in practice for actually these choices to matter. Which are these assumptions? The assumptions are essentially three, broadly speaking. One is that there are no taxes. The second is that there are no bankruptcy costs. And the third is that markets, financial markets in particular, are perfect, in the sense that they are competitive, frictionless, and they have no informational asymmetries. Now, of course, these are very strong assumptions. In practice, we live in an economy with taxes. We live in an economy where actually bankruptcy is a costly event, and there are lots of imperfection in financial markets. So essentially, the interest of these theorems lies in actually pointing us to which of these assumptions are important for the determination of the financial structure of firms and in which way. So let me first tell you a bit more about the theorems. The theorem, the Modigliani-Miller one, which is essentially the one about the relevance of capital structure, states that under those three assumptions, the value of a company, let's call it V, that is the total value of equity and debt of a company, is unaffected by its leverage. And why? Because essentially this value is simply the present discounted value of the company's cash flow, discounted at the required return for the relevant risk classes. This was the terminology that Modigliani and Merton used in showing the theorem. Not only that, not only the value is unaffected by leverage, but also the average cost of capital is unaffected by leverage, because even though the cost of debt actually, which is the interest rate, is actually often generally lower than the cost of equity, the point is that as you change leverage, and therefore you rely relatively more on the quote-unquote cheaper source of debt, actually you change implicitly and endogenously also the required return on equity in an offsetting way. So that there is no way actually of changing the average cost of capital by choosing a different level of leverage. And then the relevance of dividend policy, which is the so-called Modigliani-Miller 2, the second proposition by Modigliani-Miller, states that under the same assumptions that I mentioned before, the value of a company is unaffected by the payout ratio of the company. Now, you can think of the entire development of corporate finance since 1958. So we're talking about 60 years of development of corporate finance can be seen as the sequential or simultaneous relaxation of those three assumptions that I mentioned before of Modigliani-Miller. In that sense, it's truly foundational, as Robert Merton said. Let's talk first about the assumption of no taxes. Modigliani and Miller were the first to relax this assumption. They recognized, of course, that debt in general in most countries, and in the United States in particular, enjoys a preferential tax treatment. And, of course, under that assumption, they showed that the optimal capital structure would require much more leverage than it was currently observed in US companies. Later, Merton and Modigliani also did some further extensions of their initial theorems, taking into account that not only there were corporate taxes, but there were also personal taxes on interest income, on dividends and capital gains, and they drastically downward revised their estimates of the optimal leverage of firms. By the way, this is a typical way of proceeding by Franco, in the sense that he was always willing to modify and readapt his models to reality, in the sense of recognizing, for instance, in this case, that the tax system is more complicated than initially assumed. Bankruptcy cost was the second very important deviation from the Modigliani-Miller assumptions that was taken into account seriously by the finance profession. And many consider this to be the most important counterweight to the tax advantage of debt. That is, people recognize that while on one side firms had a benefit from relying relatively more on debt because of its tax shield benefit, that is, its tax advantages, they also recognize that having too much debt would increase the probability of bankruptcy, and therefore the probability of incurring in the costs of bankruptcy. And under certain assumptions, it is possible to show that this defines an internal optimum amount of leverage, that is, an optimal balance between debt and equity. There has been a lot of discussion and also empirical debate about the bankruptcy costs that we currently observe in most countries are sufficiently large to explain what we observe in the leverage choices of firms. The other assumption, which has been discussed widely in the finance literature, and which has essentially kept us busy for practically 40 years after Modigliani and Miller presented their theorems, is the assumption of perfect markets. Essentially, we have increasingly recognized that markets are imperfect, and they are mainly imperfect for informational reasons. Finance is not just about money, it's about information, and there is a lot of asymmetry in how this information is distributed among market participants. In particular, there is asymmetry between information which is available to company managers and that which is available to investors who fund these companies. And in a way, one could discuss and understand the development of corporate finance in the past 40 years as mainly being the removal of this assumption and different ways of actually removing this assumption that Modigliani and Miller had in their theorems. With asymmetric information, capital structure matters for two distinct reasons. One is that if you have different financial instruments, they generate different incentives for company insiders, that is, managers or controlling shareholders, and therefore they tend to affect their behavior differently. And in particular, they tend to have a different impact on what in economics we call moral hazard problems. That is, the conflict of interest between company insiders who take the decisions about the company and investors who provide the money to take those decisions or to enact those decisions. So in particular, different financial instruments, in particular debt and equity, have different impact on the tendency that company insiders have to engage in what we call risk shifting, shift risk, for instance, on the shoulders of creditors. Or they create different incentives for company insiders to extract what in finance we call private benefits of control. That is, the benefits that company insiders can extract at the expense of their funders. Moreover, different financial instruments have different ability to convey the information that company insiders have to investors. For instance, equity typically is much more sensitive to this information, and therefore it has a different ability compared to debt, in particular to safe debt, to convey such information to company outsiders, and as such has different effect on what we call in finance adverse selection issues. That is a situation in which company insiders have more information about the characteristics of the firm and its investments than company outsiders. So if you read, for instance, a famous, by now famous book in corporate finance, The Theory of Corporate Finance by Jean Tirole, what that book is essentially a 1,000 pages book, is essentially a relaxation of this set of assumptions from Modigliani-Miller. The book starts, this is one of the most used books in finance today, the book starts with a brief account of the Modigliani-Miller theorem, and then it goes saying, okay, now let's relax in particular this assumption about information symmetry. Let's take seriously the fact that there is an asymmetry of information between company insiders and outsiders, and practically all the rest of the book is a development of the many models that actually you can produce under this modified assumption. Let me then tell you something about the methodological value of Modigliani-Miller. Modigliani-Miller introduced for the first time formal reasoning in finance. This is an important point that Bob Merton made before. This was essentially at the same time as Tobin, Markowitz, and Sharp were introducing the same type of formal reasoning in the choice of portfolios, so a portfolio choice theory. So essentially, Modigliani-Miller did it essentially for corporate finance, while these other three people, who also were later Nobel Prize winners, were doing it for a portfolio choice. So specifically why Modigliani and Miller's approach was totally new at the time, because they introduced a method of proof by arbitrage, which is more general and more compelling than competitive equilibrium, because essentially no arbitrage is in a way a weaker concept than that of equilibrium, and it is therefore also a more robust concept compared. It has fewer requirements in terms of assumptions than that of equilibrium. And later, this concept was used extensively in asset pricing, especially for the pricing of derivatives. In fact, the work by Merton himself, relied on this principle as well. Modigliani and Miller, as often happens, being the first to use this method of proof, did not do it very well, in the sense that, as Modigliani himself had to recognize later on, with a certain degree of humor as well, the proof was much more laborious, as he said, than it ought to be. It went through over 30 pages, and as Franco put it sometimes, it was a true torture for many students, especially MBA students, to have to go through this very laborious proof to understand what the theorem was about. But the logic was very simple. Essentially, the logic was compare two firms, firm A and firm B, as Modigliani-Miller put it, in the same risk class. And suppose that firm A has greater leverage than firm B, and suppose that, in contrast with what the theorem says, it is worth more. It has greater value than firm B. Then investors could replicate the capital structure of firm A by mixing essentially firm B's shares and homemade leverage. So essentially they can buy the unlevered firm, firm B, and mix it with debt of their own, essentially with leverage of their own, and produce a portfolio which has exactly the same composition as that of firm A, but costs less than firm A, and they can cash the difference. Essentially, they can make an arbitrage profit. Now, we know that for this arbitrage proof, we do not need to make the assumption that two firms belong to the same risk class. We don't need to even use this assumption of risk classes. And we do not even need to assume that homemade leverage at the same interest rate as that of companies occurs. So essentially, we know that under the idea that there is no arbitrage, there is a linear pricing rule for cash flows, that essentially you can price any cash flow with a linear pricing rule. And therefore, if you price, if you take the price of debt, it is just the price of the cash flow that this debt produces. If you take the price of equity, it's just the price of the cash flow of equity, and the sum of these two, the prices of these two claims is nothing but the value of the firm, which then is the price of the total cash flow by the linearity of the pricing rule. So it's just the linearity of the pricing rule, which must be true under no arbitrage, that actually proves the Modigliani-Miller theorem. So as Franco himself had to say later on, 30 years later, you know, when you look at it with the tools, with the analytical tools and the understanding we currently have of no arbitrage pricing, you know, the result by Modigliani and Miller is almost obvious. But of course it was not at that time. And in fact, you can show it also within general equilibrium models instead of simply no arbitrage. Now, I have not talked so far about the empirical work by Franco, an empirical work in particular about Modigliani-Miller, essentially the implications of Modigliani-Miller. And this is because, in a way, this is the less durable part of the Modigliani-Miller legacy, because most of Franco's work in this area focused mostly on taxes. Now we know that the picture is much more complex than that, and empirical work in corporate finance has gone far beyond that. However, even so, I would like to remember, as Bob Merton said, that Franco's empirical work in finance still contains two very important lessons, method lessons for all of us. First, the passion always to relate theory to facts and to question and readjust the theory whenever he saw that the theory was being inadequate to actually account for those facts. So this kind of openness and willingness to discuss the theory and readjust it on the basis of its empirical relevance. And the second is his willingness to consider no assumption as sacred, including individual rationality. Now, there are some writings by Franco where he almost seems to be willing to accept the idea, which currently would be considered standard in behavioral finance or behavioral economics, that people are not perfectly rational, or that people behave, as he was saying, stupidly in some cases. He was willing to entertain this, and now this may sound practically obvious, but at the time it was considered very strange, because remember, when this was being said by Franco, most of finance and most of economics was dominated by the rational expectations assumption. Let me conclude with just one final slide on what, to me, are overall lessons of Franco's research style. So now I'm no longer talking about particularly his contribution to finance, and I'm not talking even about his other contribution that was discussed before by Bob Merton on the life cycle theory of saving and social security. It is a lesson regarding style. It's a lesson regarding research style. Franco taught me, simply by talking with him on a daily basis, that there is no real boundary between macro and finance, or if you prefer, economics as a whole and finance. Now, this may sound pretty obvious to many of you, but actually most economists narrowly confine themselves either to the study of finance or to the study of, say, macroeconomics, to the point that when the great crisis, financial crisis of a few years broke out, essentially many economists were not prepared to see that it was at the same time a financial crisis, and being a systemic crisis was also a crisis which had very deep macroeconomic repercussions. Now, Franco would not have been at all surprised by something like this. To Franco, there was no true boundary between finance and macro. He would go to the so-called money workshop at MIT, which was macro, and he would go to the finance workshop at the Sloan School, and he would constantly, in his research activity, go back and forth between these two areas. In this sense, he is a great example, and he should be a great example for the future, for young economists, for instance, or future researchers who are sitting in this room, because he took a very holistic view of how finance and macro really truly interact in the real world. And the second big lesson by Franco is that research must not lose sight of real-world policy issues. And this was mentioned before several times. It is, again, it may sound like a totally obvious thing, but in fact, many economists don't do that at all. Many economists actually ignore completely the potential relevance, policy relevance of what they are studying. And they even refrain from discussing the empirical the policy implications of their theories. So had we followed in Franco's footsteps in these two respects, that is, see the interactions between macro and finance and not lose sight of real-world policy issues, I think we would have done a better service as an economics profession. Thank you.
Bene, prima di passare alla seconda sessione abbiamo il tempo, lo spazio per un paio di domande da parte dell'audience per i primi due relatori, in modo tale da concentrare sia l'attenzione sia le domande sui due temi che sono oggetto del convegno.
Volevo fare una domanda sulla teoria del ciclo vitale. Volevo sapere se Modigliani si era interessato alla distribuzione del reddito. In tutti i paesi occidentali l'80% delle ricchezze finanziarie è concentrato nel 10% della popolazione e molti organi di stampa in America osservano come un'eventuale crisi finanziaria avrebbe effetti quasi rilevanti per la stragrande maggioranza degli americani, che hanno talmente pochi risparmi da esserne influenzati in modo minimo. Per altro verso, anche in Italia, Assogestioni conferma questa distribuzione delle ricchezze finanziarie, soprattutto relativamente a persone anche più anziane, quindi ricchi ed anziani. Quindi la mia domanda è fatta da due parti. Uno, Modigliani si era interessato dalla distribuzione del reddito? Secondo, le scelte economiche delle persone molto ricche, anziane e con esperienza potrebbero essere orientate in senso anticiclico e quindi stabilizzante per l'economia? Ho letto analisi di McKinsey che per i prossimi 20 anni prevedono una sostanziale stabilità. Mi chiedo se quindi le scelte economiche controcicliche di chi non ha necessità di vendere in situazioni di crisi possono essere stabilizzanti.
Grazie.
Well, that's a very important and profound question. I am reluctant to speak exactly on what Professor Modigliani had to say on income distribution. I think it's safe to say that knowing him and what he spoke about on so many occasions, of course he was worried about income distribution. Of course he was worried about the impact on all people in society, and certainly on those who make up the majority of society. So that's the best I can tell you, because I don't know his work on that, but I'm very comfortable with that. As to what you raise as the set of facts, like many facts I've mentioned, it's always much more complex, and I don't want to turn this into a seminar on the issue of wage and wealth and income distributions. I would say this about the life cycle hypothesis. It was antithetical to, it was the opposite to Marxist theory of economics, which was the extreme, that the only wealth, the only saving, the only accumulation were done by the very wealthiest of wealthy capitalists, and that the rest of society never ended up saving anything, and therefore never really accumulated wealth. The life cycle hypothesis, its very nature, showed that indeed it was quite rational, and indeed it seemed empirically correct, that people were saving, all people were saving, but perhaps with the very, very poorest being an exception, okay? But in the vast majority, we were saving. The kinds of savings were not always measured by the income accounts. Appreciation in housing, which is just as much a value as adding, was not added into the income accounts. The measures of inequality are very sensitive to what metrics you use. I don't want to get into that. So I'm not to say there isn't an issue of income or wealth inequality, but that's not a new phenomenon. And it's a phenomenon that you have to compare as to how it's been addressed, and that in a balanced state, much of the wealth is often held implicitly in things like pension plans and so forth, which are not attributed to the wealth of the individuals, but indeed are very much the part of their wealth. So rather than go on and on about a very interesting and important and topical question, I'd simply say that Franco Modigliani absolutely cared about everyone, but particularly the vast bulk of society. He was not just simply a technocrat looking at efficiency. He did worry very much about the impact, both in employment and in social welfare.
Bene, ringraziamo ancora i due nostri primi speaker e chiediamo di salire sul palco i nostri secondi due speaker per la seconda sessione. Bene, in questa seconda sessione abbiamo Robert Engel, premio Nobel per l'economia del 2003, e Gianni Misano della Federal Reserve di Washington. Anche in questa seconda sessione il lascito scientifico, il pensiero scientifico di Franco Modigliani è presente nelle relazioni che adesso ascolteremo, essendo noto ma anche ricordato nei saluti iniziali dal dottor Kuhn, quando ha ricordato il prezioso contributo che Franco Modigliani diede allo sviluppo dei modelli econometrici per la previsione delle dinamiche macroeconomiche, in particolare con la collaborazione nata in Banca d'Italia. Fu chiamato da Guido Carli, quindi, come dire, il filo che lega Modigliani a Brescia non c'è solo per l'intuizione geniale che ha avuto I.S.E.O e quindi Riccardo Venchiarutti, ma anche per questo legame che nasce da Guido Carli. Ricordo che è nato a Brescia, quindi è un bresciano. Lo sguardo, come dire, teorico e metodologico di Robert Engel, in particolare concentrando l'attenzione sul rischio sistemico e le crisi finanziarie, in questa sessione viene qui ad intrecciarsi con alcune riflessioni operative di Gianni Misano su come i modelli econometrici, le tecniche, gli strumenti statistici, ma anche i dati, la massa di dati che oggi abbiamo a disposizione, possono essere utilizzati per formulare delle previsioni macroeconomiche in scenari incerti. Prima Marco Pagano citava la grande visione di Franco Modigliani nell'intrecciare finanza, macroeconomia e quindi anche econometria, con quindi un approccio olistico alla risoluzione dei problemi, grandi problemi di carattere macroeconomico ma anche finanziario. E in questa sessione quindi sentiremo dai due speaker quali sono le riflessioni che toccano essenzialmente e vanno a intersecare i due grandi temi: finanza, previsioni macroeconomiche e l'econometria come strumento analitico per formulare una previsione. Il primo illustre speaker di questa seconda sessione è Robert Engel, professore di finanza presso la Stern School of Business della New York University. È stato insignito del premio Nobel per l'economia nel 2003 con Cliff Granger per aver sviluppato metodi di analisi delle serie storiche economiche con volatilità variabile nel tempo. È attualmente direttore della New York University Stern Volatility Institute e cofondatore della Society for Financial Econometrics, SOFI, che è un'organizzazione non profit ospitata presso la stessa New York University. È da tempo che Robert si occupa di rischio sistemico e crisi finanziarie, ma anche per, come dire, dare il set informativo su quali debbano essere i paradigmi su cui costruire una stabilità finanziaria globale. Robert.
Well, thank you very much, Roberto. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed several meetings in this setting in Brescia, and I'm extremely happy to be able to be here to celebrate Franco Modigliani's 100th birthday. I arrived at MIT as a new assistant professor, just probably a few years older than many of you in the back that I met yesterday. It was a pretty intimidating environment with Samuelson and Solow and Modigliani and all these famous economists around. But Franco took me under his wing. And I remember he asked me if I would sit on a thesis committee with a student of his. That student turned out to be Michael Brennan, who has gone on to be an extremely famous finance professor. He had another faculty member that he brought onto the committee named Myron Scholes. And so the three of us supervised this thesis, and it was on the capital asset pricing model, which has not been discussed, but Franco was very interested in the capital asset pricing model because he was interested in finance applications. In a second story, I was teaching undergraduate macroeconomics. This was not exactly my field, but it was something that I knew a fair amount about, and Franco was helpful to me. And one of the things that was very powerful in those days was the use of macro models. Franco had been in the forefront with Albert Andu of building one of the big forecasting models of the macroeconomy. It was later adopted by the Fed and is still in operation at the Fed. And these models were able to analyze all the sectors of the U.S. and ultimately global economy. They came under a lot of criticism later, but this was really the centerpiece of macroeconomics. And I was able to use this model in this class and teach students how it worked, how you built models, how you forecasted. Franco came and gave a lecture in my class, and one of my good students was Larry Summers. And he was an undergraduate, he was a sophomore at MIT, and of course went on to become another very famous economist. So Franco was very helpful in this. And then a third story I'd like to mention is that we invited Franco to dinner. So he and Serena came to our house, and we were just young folks, and my wife decided she would make eggplant parmesan because she'd heard it was his favorite. This is brave cooking because Franco knew his Italian food much better than we did. But he was very generous about it. Oh, this is the best eggplant parmesan I've ever had. Serena, you must learn how she did it. And all. He was a very nice man, and he was very supportive. And I am honored to be here on the podium talking about what his legacy is today. I'm actually going to give you a talk that I would love to hear Franco's comments on, because this is a talk about the financial crisis and the macro finance intersection between macro and finance that became so apparent, as Marco said, during the financial crisis. And I'm going to give you what I hope will be an example of the kind of thing Franco would do, some combination of rigor and relevance. This is, I thought, Bob's great characterization of 2 words to summarize the way he thought about modeling and describing the world. So that's what I'm going to try to do, and I'm going to try to do it without too much pain and suffering. So here, for example, is a map of the world that we produce every day at the Volatility Institute at NYU. And this map is color-coded for volatility. And where it's red, it means that the financial markets are highly volatile. Where it's green, it means the financial markets are calm. There is very little volatility. And what you see here is a map which has a lot of red on it. And that's because this map was recorded shortly, a couple of days after the vote on Brexit. And the question is this amount of volatility so much that we have a financial crisis to worry about? Is this map of the world too much risk? And what happens next? Well, it turns out that the volatility of Brexit died away over the next few months of the summer, but it's likely to reappear as we continually negotiate this complex process. If you want to see what this map looks like today, you can actually go on your phone and check out VLab. It's if you can't, the address is on here, but if you can't remember it, just Google VLab and you will see this, this citation come up. And if you go to VLab, you'll find that it has risks of a lot of different kinds. It has volatility, correlations, systemic risk, long-run value at risk, liquidity analysis, fixed income analysis, and climate risk in it. We discussed yesterday with the wonderful students from the summer school all the features that are in this model, but we're going to talk just today about systemic risk. If you look at the map today, however, it doesn't look like it did after Brexit. It's pretty much all green. We're once again in a very low volatility time in the global economy. But if you look actually a couple of months ago, it was red again, and this is a result of the Fed starting the process of raising interest rates, where the markets all over the world, the equity markets, actually responded by increased volatility. We've had a couple of months of this. Some of it has been carried forward by the protectionist trade talks, but at the moment, the markets seem calm. But that doesn't mean that there is no risk out there. It just means that there is no risk that's going to materialize in the next few days. It may very well be that there are long-term risks that we should worry about, and one of them is whether we might have another financial crisis like the last one. And to introduce that, I have a short video which focuses on something like this volcano.
The Tarunarora Volcano, located in central Ecuador, soars 16,480 feet into the sky. In some ways, the dormant volcano has many similarities to a financial system. It may function calmly for many years, and we may be unaware of its weaknesses. If we take this analogy a step further, volcanologists install measurement devices to see what is going on beneath the surface of the Earth. They use theories of the behavior of the magma to infer the probability of an eruption. Eventually, the dormant volcano may erupt, causing massive damage to the environment and to people's lives. Today, we're going to apply the same methodology to look at the stability of financial markets.
How much produces a financial crisis? The way we examine this in most countries is to do stress tests of the financial sector. We examine whether banks have sufficient capital so they can withstand a downturn such as the financial crisis. This views a crisis as due to some external shock, and the question of whether the banks can survive this shock is being examined by the stress test. But I think the reason we're most interested in the stress tests is because it shows that the banks are vulnerable, and therefore it would be natural for them to try to strengthen their balance sheets so they are not vulnerable anymore. The process of recapitalizing the bank, which is a lot like the Modigliani-Miller problem, the problem of recapitalizing the bank is exactly what we think causes the financial crisis. And so we would like to know when the banks are sufficiently undercapitalized that this process looks dangerous to financial stability. It's widely believed that excessive credit growth is the fundamental cause of financial crises. But the problem is it's unclear how to define when credit growth is excessive versus just a side effect of growth itself. A simple example from the mortgage market might help clarify this. If we are in the late stages of a credit expansion, it's natural for banks to make mortgage loans to underqualified buyers with overvalued collateral, that is, houses that are not worth as much as the borrower says they are. If you do this, the market value of this mortgage is going to be less than the accounting value of the mortgage. If there is a downturn in the economy, then the borrowers will become weaker and the collateral will become weaker, suggesting further declines in the value of these mortgages. The net effect of this is that the bank's reserves will be brought to cover these losses. Their capital will erode through the equity market, and the question is, will they have enough capital to continue to function as banks? And if not, how much capital would it take to recapitalize them? So the idea is that credit growth is excessive if the financial sector does not have sufficient capital to cover the losses in the downturn. That's what we want to measure, and that's what our statistical approach is trying to do. It's trying to answer this question. How much capital would a financial institution need to raise in order to continue to function normally if we have another financial crisis like the one from the mortgage-backed securities in 2007 to 2009? I think I promised no equations. This sort of looks like an equation. But let me just tell you what this is about. Banks are a little bit like households. Households have savings, which they might need if you lose a job or something happens to your business. Do you have enough savings to cover the losses that you would expect in a downturn like what we saw in the financial crisis? Households can ask this of themselves. We can ask it of the banks. What we have to ask when we ask about banks is, how much would a downturn lead to in terms of declining value of the firm? And that is going to be measured by the declining value of the equity of the firm. And so we would like to know, when the global equity market collapses, how much any particular company's stock is going to go down. And that is, in finance, measured by the beta of this firm. And so firms have betas, and that's the econometric problem that we are faced with. How do we build a model of the beta of a firm when we think that the beta changes over time and is different across firms depending on what their asset mix is and what the problem foreseen by the market looks like? We are going to use this with something called dynamic conditional beta, which is basically an outgrowth of the work that I did on heteroscedasticity for the Nobel Prize. How does it work? Well, if you run a regression, you get a coefficient, which we call beta. And often, as econometricians and empirical workers, we don't worry too much about whether this beta is constant over time or not. But if you think about it, it's unlikely that it's really constant over time. The beta, as you can see in the second line, is really a correlation times the ratio of two variances. And in these pictures that I showed you at the beginning, variances were different between periods after Brexit, right after Brexit, and much later, between January and February, between February and today. The variances are always changing. So it would be surprising if correlations didn't change, and it would be surprising if the betas didn't change. So the process we use in this model building is to estimate each of these volatilities and estimate the correlation and put them together to get a beta. So this gives us betas which vary over time. And we use this kind of framework. We estimate a type of Garch model for each asset. We use a type of DCC model for estimating the correlations, and we get a beta. We do a little statistical test, which I won't describe now, and this is what we get. This is the beta for Citigroup. And what it means is if the global financial markets decline by 40% over the next 6 months, which is what happened during the financial crisis, then a company that has a beta of 1 will find its stock price will go down by 40% over the next 6 months. That's what the expected value would be. If the beta is bigger than that, it will decline more than that. And if you look at Citi as a whole, you see on average, it pretty much has a beta pretty close to 1, maybe a little bit above 1. But during the financial crisis on the left here, you see the beta soared to a whole lot more than that. It is as high as 4, which means that this 40% decline in the global stock market translated into a much greater decline for Citi than for other firms. Why is that? Because Citi was heavily involved in the mortgage-backed security business and therefore was especially vulnerable to the factors which were reducing the global stock market. If you look at Goldman Sachs, you don't see the same rise in beta during the financial crisis, but you can see that on average its beta is greater because it's a riskier company as a whole. If you look at BNP Paribas, you see there was no effect during the US-led mortgage-backed financial crisis, but during the European sovereign debt crisis, the beta rose very substantially because BNP was heavily invested in sovereign debt of the Eurozone, which was the instrument which was most vulnerable to the European sovereign debt crisis. You also see here some evidence of Brexit. That's the Brexit peak for BNP Paribas. If you look at Barclays, you see that Brexit peak is even more severe, the beta increasing very substantially for Barclays during the Brexit period. But they also had some increase during the global financial crisis and the European sovereign debt crisis. Well, we do this every week for more than 1,000 financial firms around the world. What do we see? So here's a picture of risk-taking. So can I call your attention to this pink visor? Can you see that? That's my wife sitting in the second row here. We are in Patagonia and on a river, and if I can get this, this is me. These are my son and daughter-in-law, and this man is the risk manager. And as risk manager, he has about 1.5 seconds left before he loses all his credibility as risk manager, because we are just about in the water. When we look at the world, we can ask, how much would it cost to recapitalize all the financial institutions in the world if we have another financial crisis? And you can see the peak from the financial crisis in 2009. You can see the peak from the European sovereign debt crisis in 2012. You can see a third peak in 2016 and 17, which has no name, but I think we might someday call this the Asian debt crisis, or maybe the Chinese debt crisis. And you might see all the way at the end that there is a disturbing increase in this measure right at the end of the sample. And we don't yet know whether that's noise and will go away like the Brexit noise did, or whether this is the beginning of another episode of undercapitalization in the financial sector. The country with the largest value of S risk is China, followed by Japan, and then France, and US. If you look at the US over the last 10 years, you see a very promising story of improved capital adequacy in US financial system, although it does have an upturn at the end, just as we saw globally. If you look back in time, which I don't think I have time to do today, you can see what this looked like before the financial crisis and which firms were vulnerable. And, well, maybe I'll show you this. The top of the list, again, is Citigroup. So as of the end of August 2008, 2 weeks before Lehman's bankruptcy, Citigroup was the most systemically risky firm by this measure, followed by J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, Freddie Mac, Merrill Lynch, Fannie Mae, AIG, Goldman Sachs, and Wachovia. Those were the top 10. And if you think about it, we rescued all 10 of them. We passed the TARP bill, we provided money through the Fed, and we nationalized both Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. Merrill Lynch was purchased, and AIG was saved. So Lehman was not the most risky, but it was the one that didn't get rescued. And neither did Washington Mutual, which is two further down on this list. So I think this list and this way of measuring is fairly consistent with what policy regulators did. We have done work to compare this ranking of risk with what the Basel Committee comes up with, what the CCAR stress tests look like in the US, what the EBA and the ECB stress tests look like in Europe, and pretty much the correlations are very high. So let me just jump forward to Europe. Some of you are interested in Europe. What you see in Europe is a story of improvement, but not as great as it is in the US. And there is, again, this worrying increase right at the end. Italy. Italy was not so impacted by the first financial crisis, the mortgage-backed security crisis, but was really devastated by the sovereign debt crisis, and that peak lasted a long time. The third peak also was very important for Italy, and it corresponded to the failure of Monte Paschi di Siena. And now we see this, again, worrying increase right at the end. But the story is much worse in Asia. You see this substantial increase over time, and if you look at China, it's even steeper. This is why I think most of our concern is, will China and perhaps Japan be able to manage the debt that they are accumulating? So we are, again, going to ask this question: how much is too much? In other words, are we at a tipping point for this risk? And from this picture is obviously a picture of too much risk. But whether the previous ones are or not, we will see. So we would like to know, given the what? It's not Photoshop, it's real. But it's a good picture. We would like to know what's the probability of a crisis when the S-risk gets to a certain level. And we'd like to know what is the level beyond which the probability of a crisis rises above a half. And this is a matter of understanding the endogenous process by which a crisis arises. So if we have banks with high S-risk, then they will look vulnerable, and either their risk managers or the regulators will tell them they have to do something. What can they do? Well, there are really sort of several ways they can strengthen their balance sheet. They can do nothing and hope for good luck in their investment programs. They can sell new shares of stock, and they could sell assets and use the proceeds to retire the debt. These are all potential ways of dealing with too much leverage and undercapitalization. The most common solution is the third one, to sell assets and retire debt. And the reason that's a problem is because that is likely to lead to declining values of assets, which will be declining not only for the bank that's selling them, but for any other bank that holds the same kind of assets. We call this a fire sale of assets, and it's really what we saw during the great financial crisis, as all the banks that owned, and banks and non-banks that owned mortgage-backed securities, recognized that their value was going down and tried to sell them. Trying hard to sell them led to lower and lower prices, which led to worse and worse capitalization of the institutions. And this spiral is one of the features that we think is important in understanding the financial crisis. The same thing happened in the European sovereign debt crisis, and eventually the ECB stepped in to buy, as a buyer of last resort of the sovereign debt with its quantitative easing. The likelihood of a fire sale is greater if there are more assets being sold, and in particular if the quantity of assets that need to be sold is high compared to the quantity of total assets that are out there, because that means that everybody's going to be a seller. There are going to be very few buyers, and that's a bad outcome, as you can see. So we are going to use a measure like that, and we're going to try to predict whether there's a financial crisis in different countries, and we're going to use a measure of a crisis created by the Roemers for 24 industrial countries using OECD reports. They classify countries from 0 to 15, depending on whether there is no crisis to whether there is a very extreme crisis. And we're going to use an intermediate value of 4 to say, well, it's just a minor crisis if it's less than 4. So we're going to estimate a model that tells us what's the probability of a crisis given the S-risk. And that's going to use different countries and different times. And we're going to estimate this with something called a Tobit model. And I suspect if I ask you how many of you are interested in the Tobit model, everybody's going to raise their hand. Nobody. Okay, I'll just tell you what it does. Instead of fitting a straight line like we normally do, it fits a hockey stick. Okay? Because for 2/3 of these observations, there's no crisis. So the dependent variable is 0. But then for the rest of them, it goes up. So we want a hockey stick shaped response. And this nice slide that you can look at your leisure, talks about what the Tobit model does, and talks about how you can use it to measure the probability. I'm not going to show you this. I'm going to show you the second model. These are the models that we've estimated. The first one says the probability of a crisis depends on the assets for sale divided by the total assets in a country and the change in that. That's a very sensible sort of model. It tells you when you think the risk is going to be high. The second model, which actually is a more interesting model, tells you that it actually also depends on whether the rest of the world is undercapitalized or not. So the risk in Italy is going to depend on the risk in all the rest of the world. And that's one of the key features of a financial crisis, and it's one of the key features of this model. In fact, there are two externalities that are like this. One is that the risk of any one financial institution, a bank or other financial institution, depends on the risk of the other ones in the country as well. So you can't just say it's one bank that's causing this, it's the sum of all the capital needs of all the banks that really matters. And secondly, it's not just one country that matters, it's also the rest of the world that matters. So this is a motivation for both country and global coordination and regulation. So putting this together, I have just some pictures and then I'm done. The picture here is, this in orange is the same as what I showed you before, although it starts now in 2000 instead of starting at the financial crisis. But what's new is we also have the S-risk capacity. And what you see in the blue in the background is how much capacity the U.S. has to withstand undercapitalization in the banking sector. And interestingly enough, during the financial crisis, the blue curve drops dramatically. But the reason that happens is because the rest of the world is undercapitalized. And that people from the rest of the world are going to be selling assets. And the U.S. therefore has less capacity to sell these assets than they would otherwise. In the bottom picture, there is the probability of a crisis. And as you see in 2009, it's very close to 1, which means we were almost surely in a financial crisis, and no one would disagree with that explanation. You see, it was actually pretty high during the European sovereign debt crisis, and less so during the Asian crisis. But what do we see for Spain? Well, we see the probabilities were close to 1 3 times, but the one that's the longest and most lasting was the European sovereign debt crisis, which, again, is not very much of a surprise. And you can see, again, that the capacity curve drops down in each case when there is a global financial crisis. In Greece, the first one is short and they recovered pretty quickly from it, but the second one is long-lasting and recurs a third time. Australia never really was in trouble. Their S-risk stayed well below capacity throughout this. And what about Italy? So this picture is Italy, and what you see is the something, it looks kind of like Spain, really. I think a lot of the economics are similar. You see the probability of crisis approaching 1 during the financial crisis, but then it goes down again. But when it rises a second time, the Italian experience with a financial crisis is long-lasting. It's several years of crisis conditions and high undercapitalization of the banks. They barely got their S-risk down below capacity before this third peak came, and at the far right you see the increase in Italy, which again is worrisome. It's still below the capacity of Italy, we think, but following up on this idea that was in the little video, we want to monitor this. And one of the ways to monitor it is to see how these numbers evolve over time, because we're going to keep producing them every week, and you can look at it on your phone and see how Italy is doing and other places that you're interested in. So I did a few other things, but I won't bother you with those. Some robustness checks, a conclusion. Let me just finish with a slide which I think says a lot. These are two of my grandsons looking out over a peaceful lake, wondering what's in their future. Is there more financial crisis in their future? And maybe they're not really wondering that. It's possible they just want to know whether they can go swimming or not. But anyway, I think that's a nice place to leave this. And I think I would love to know what Franco thinks of this sort of analysis. Or I'd also love to know what he would have done with the financial crisis. So, thank you.
Ed è con grande piacere che introduco il nostro ultimo speaker, Gianni Misano, che è stato anche nostro collega presso l'ex facoltà di economia, oggi Dipartimento di Economia e Management. Gianni ha conseguito un PhD in economia alla Warwick University e, dopo essere stato titolare della cattedra di econometria presso il nostro Ateneo, ha ricoperto il ruolo di Senior e Principal Economist alla Banca Centrale Europea, per arrivare poi alla Federal Reserve di Washington, dove dal 2015 è a capo della divisione Current Macroeconomic Conditions. Gianni ci parlerà di previsioni in un mondo incerto e lo farà da una prospettiva di grande interesse, perché è quella della Federal Reserve. E devo dire che pensando al post-Brexit, ma anche al post-quantitative easing, la notizia della settimana scorsa che ci sarà il prossimo dicembre, siamo tutti molto interessati a sentire la tua presentazione. Prego Gianni.
Okay, I'm so very pleased to be here in Brescia. This is the place where I started my career and where I had a lot of very formative experiences with great, fantastic students and amazing colleagues. So I, in a sense, I mean, my connection with Franco Modigliani's work is that, Franco, as was recalled several times today, had also a great impact on the central banking community. And it has been kind of taken into consideration the fact that now at the board we have a model, we have several models, but we have particularly one model which is called the FRB-US, which is a direct descendant of the work that was, kind of propagated by Franco Modigliani in these quarters. And so what I'm going to do today is give you a sort of a bird's eye view of the kind of work that we do in a central banking environment to do forecasting and to take into account that we live in an uncertain world and that decisions have to be taken and that we can avail of information, and we can avail of models, and we can avail of human expertise in processing data. Of course, I mean, the usual disclaimer applies, so, this is, kind of a personal view of what's going on. And also I have to be quite honest on the fact that I'm folded in a lot of contributions that were taken from people in my group and in groups which are related to my work. Okay, so let me see. The plan of the talk is the following. So I'll give you a little bit of background of what we do and how things work at the Fed in terms of forecasting. Then I will focus on one particular aspect of our activity, which is what we call the nowcasting, especially of GDP, of the economic activity, and which, is nothing else than, basically trying to understand where the current situation of the economy is, in particular for GDP. And then I will talk a little bit about another effort that is quite central in our activity, which is basically the production of measures of what we call the output gap. Basically, how much of the signal that we see in terms of macroeconomic indicators has to be attributed to variation in the cyclical conditions. Okay? Which are basically of this is where the most interest of the policymaker is, because we know that, the central banks have at least the Federal Reserve has the mandate to stabilize the real part of the economy, and therefore it's important to understand, where the economic cycle is. Okay, and I will offer some final considerations at the end. So you have here, the opportunity to see, in a sense, how, how the sausages are made in terms of the forecast. Okay, so the general board, I will be referring to my institution as the board, because it's, Federal Reserve Board is a mouthful, so, we just say the board. So the main, it's interesting to know that the forecasting approach of the board is mainly judgmental. So this means that, we use models, but models are used in conjunction with human expertise. And this is a kind of an interesting combination because, no model can take into consideration the richness and the sensitivity that, sector analysts have. And the real talent is to bring together, basically what we get from the model, which is rigor and discipline, from what you get from the analysts, which is a lot of understanding of what's going on in the details of the particular sectors of their competence, and also a lot of very interesting and useful information about the quality and the reliability of the data that are being used for the forecasting. So, models and human expertise are regarded as, kind of a strict complements rather than substitute. Here, there's a former director of my division, which, basically put it in nice words, saying economic analysis is both a science and an art. Science enters through the use of sophisticated econometrics and rigorous theory, and art enters in order to deal with the shortcomings of science. And I would say also shortcomings of, the data, in a sense. So how does the Federal Reserve system works? There is a FOMC, which is the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the body that takes the decisions of monetary policy. And they meet every 6 weeks. And it is composed of 7 members of the Board of Governors and 5 of the 12 Reserve Bank presidents. So the role of the staff is not to recommend policies, but to provide the forecasts and the analysis that will facilitate the committee in deliberations and decisions. So we have really to be cognizant of this fact. Also the fact that the FOMC is quite a wide apparatus, in the sense that it has people with very different backgrounds and different skills. And there is also a very big premium which is paid to, which has to be given also to the simplicity. So this is something that has to be taken into consideration when we think about the analysis and the tools that are used in a central banking world. So everything, needs to be not unnecessarily complex in order to, be vehiculated. And so the forecast is usually conditional on a particular assumption about the path of the monetary policy during the horizon. So the process that takes place at the board in order to come out with our forecast, which are... I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Sorry about that. So the forecast is formed in this very kind of a convoluted mechanism. So there is, at the start of the process, there is a coordinator, which is a person, it's a colleague, and, you have to have pity for him because he's basically slave to this process for, about 6 weeks. Provides the conditioning assumptions as well as initial path for output of inflation, which are often those of the previous forecast. Okay, so given these conditioning assumptions, then and the economic and the financial information that becomes gradually available since the previous forecast, the analysts adjust their projections for the sectors, and then the forecasts are assembled to make up a top line, and then there are iterations, as if it was some kind of a kind of optimization procedure or fixed point kind of a procedure. The models that we use at the board have these large-scale models we were talking about before relies primarily on quarterly time series data. I'm talking about mainly this FRB US model I was referring to before. And in a sense, they neglect the potentially valuable information that comes from containing monthly and weekly data that continuously accrue. Okay? So in interpreting this data is essentially to pinning down the near-term dynamics of the economy. So you can think about having the model in the background or some models in the background which are, basically live on a quarterly basis, but then, basically having, the assessment of the conditions being informed by tick by, nearly tick by tick information. And the staff which is involved in the judgmental forecast will exploit a vast array of econometric tools and statistical models in filtering and extracting the information that comes from higher frequency data. This is something which is akin to an instrument that we use, which is this Kalman filter, basically to continue updating our guesses about where the economy is and where the economy is going on the basis of the information that comes available, okay? And as I was saying before, the human expertise is also very useful and I would say completely necessary to add also extra model information and anecdotal evidence into the forecast. Because we are plagued by shocks and the news that basically cannot really be put into the model in a very simple form, or cannot be directly, immediately reflected in measures that can be put into the models. Thinking about, for instance, strikes, natural disasters, and stuff like that. So now, what is nowcasting? Nowcasting is basically the prediction of the recent past and the present and the near future for the variables which are of key interest for the policymakers. So what we do is basically in nowcasting model is parsing through the lenses of the model the flow of the data in real time and casting this data flow into units of a useful number, a useful concept, which is basically the quarterly growth rate of GDP at an annual rate. So we all know, and that if the economic variables are forecastable, I'm just now focusing here for a second on GDP. This is, in the very short term. It's very, it's just like, weather forecasting. You can forecast the weather 2-3 days ahead, but, then it becomes, totally unreliable. And for our forecast, the uncertainty that surrounds forecast, for quarterly data is really very big, already 1-2 quarters ahead. So we're basically, just trying to understand where we are now and possibly where we would be in the next quarter. This is already kind of a very difficult task. And, so the table in this slide just makes this point, basically. If there is any forecastability, this is in the very short run, okay? So how does the real data flow? So this is basically a kind of a calendar in which there are all these entries which mark, relevant data releases. Okay, so think about, so we have, basically some of these are measures, some are economic data, so they come out, they come out, we have the employment situation report that comes out at the beginning of every month. And, this kind of translates into time series or new bits of time series that enter the models. And then there are also other things which are basically press, speeches or declarations, I don't know, maybe sometimes even tweet feeds and stuff like that, that affect basically the behavior of the markets and the behavior of and our understanding of where the situation is. And, many of these entries will make eventually they enter the models, our models, and they basically are used to update our inference on GDP. And this is basically what we do in our unit. Our unit is called is a section of the Division of Research and Statistics, and our section is called Current Macroeconomic Condition. And this is what we do. Okay, so I never promised not to put any equations, so I'm putting all the equations I want. But I will be just very brief about this. So basically, I will be talking about one of the instruments that we use the most in our section, which is the use of what we call the dynamic factor model. This is due to the work basically by very kind of influential econometricians in the world, like Jim Stock and Mark Watson and Lucrezia Racklin and Marco Lippi and Mark Allen and also other co-authors. And basically the idea is the following. So we have a very large set of series, YT, so we have a lot of variables that we take into consideration. And think about this YT, which sits on the left-hand side of this equation, as being kind of a very large, okay? Over 100 or, even, in many cases, thousands of series, okay? And then think about a way in which you want to take all these things, all this information into consideration in order to make efficiently use of this information to make kind of a forecast or a nowcast for GDP, okay? So the dynamic factor model does something which is very simple. It says, okay, so think about that the joint behavior of this huge amount of series YT is determined by a very small number of factors, okay, which I here indicate in red, and it's FT, okay? And then the rest is noise, okay? So the key thing to understand is that the number of factor R is very much smaller than N, capital N, the number of series which are taken into consideration. Okay, so models like this, but not only like this, not only this model, are a useful tool that will allow us basically to take into consideration how a lot of information can be kind of distilled, like in a food blender, to kind of get some information on the macroeconomic conditions. Okay, so forecasting GDP. So if we think about like having a variable which we call YT GDP, which is GDP at time t, and omega tau, which is the vintage of data, so a lot of information that we have at time tau, then basically a nowcast for GDP is the conditional expectation of that variables on the grounds of the information that we have. Okay? So basically, that's what we do. So we take what we know, and we basically try to do inference on something that we don't know, which is basically GDP in the current quarters and the next quarters. So this information set is characterized in macroeconomics by some peculiar features. In particular, it is characterized by what we call the rugged edge. So the rugged edge means that the data at the end of the sample, they do not accrue at the same time. Okay? So some variable come every month. They're measured every month, like, for instance, labor market statistics. Some other variables instead come, every quarter, for instance, like GDP and other quarterly aggregates. And some other variables instead are measured continuously. So, for instance, about stock prices and stuff like that. Some other variables are, available every week, like unemployment claims and things like that. So this uneven pace of availability of new observation has to be taken into consideration by the model. So as I said before, also the variables are mixed frequencies. So some variables are monthly, some are quarterly, and so on and so forth. So, basically, these are the features that are, kind of, in a sense, complicated analysis. And then also, as I was saying before, that we have a lot of indicators, and, so macroeconomists, were not really typically very used to deal with very large data set. Now they are, and I think it's a progress for the profession. So, in particular, at the board, in our DFM models, we have a model which is quite large. There are about 120 macroeconomic and financial variables, broadly grouped into 8 categories: consumption, housing, construction, international trade, labor market, income, manufacturing prices, and financial variables. The models are set to a monthly frequency, but of course the GDP is quarterly. And there are also daily and weekly variables like financial variables, oil prices, unemployment claims, and so on and so forth. And what we do is that every day we run the model, and the model is constantly updated, receiving new information. Okay? And basically the output of the model is to parse, so to generate revision in the conditional expectation for GDP, and to inform the way in which this revision has been generated by the news received by new data. Okay? And so basically this is kind of a picture. I don't know how legible this is, but it's basically the output of our model. So here we have the time. We have the time, which is the different calendar days, and we have different color codes for the different categories of the new data. And at the end of the column, we basically show how we change our forecast, our conditional distribution for current quarter or next quarter GDP. And this is also another bit of information which vehiculates the same procedure in a different graphic form. So you can see here on the graphic, on the time axis, different periods. Basically we start from here. I explain what happened basically from May 20, 2016 to October the same year. And so we show, the line above is basically how our nowcast for GDP has changed, and the bottom part of the graph shows the contribution of the different news. Okay, so that's basically what the way in which the model operates. So of course there are a lot of uncertainty, and one very major source of uncertainty is also connected to the fact that we can always think about our models as being potentially misspecified, and one way that we have to correct for that or to take that into consideration is to use a multimodal base. And we are now in the process of developing a wide suite of models that, in a sense, take into consideration different kinds of models and different ways to obtain this forecast, and to pull them together in a sound statistical way. The other thing which is important and in which we have been working very recently is connected to the fact that it's very difficult to reflect very important changes, very important events in terms of models. Okay, so for instance, think about the kind of events that have been already mentioned before. So we are in a situation in which, for instance, there is the end of the quantitative easing, which marks a new phase. There is, obviously, there are some other events, for instance, the outcome of an election in a particularly important country in Southern Europe, maybe this might also have some consequences at certain levels. The event of the consequences of Brexit. To think about also things that connect more directly with the U.S. economy, the unfolding framework of the possibilities and the effects and the retaliation effects that a trade war might have on uncertainty and on investments and on macroeconomic aggregates. These are all things that, in a sense, suggest us to have some caution on the reliability of models that are, kind of a time invariant, basically that postulate some invariant relationship among the variables. And so we have been investing a lot of efforts in order to understand how to basically take into consideration the fact that these relationships among variables, among the variables that we use for our forecasts, might not be so stable. Okay? For instance, what we have seen is that since the end of the great financial crisis, it seems as if that GDP growth rate has been hovering at a lower, at least in the US, has been hovering at a lower level if compared to the previous to the pre-crisis period, and therefore we have been incorporating mechanisms in order to allow for some variation in the rate of growth that in a situation in which now we have a lower kind of a level of growth rate. And so we have incorporated this with models that have some mechanisms to incorporate this slowdown, okay, in a flexible way. And we've seen that models that have some time variation in the intercepts will work quite well. Another aspect which is also interesting is that if you do not confine yourself to the having point forecast, but you also want to give measures of uncertainty, it's quite evident that the volatility has changed and continues changing. And, so the first generation of nowcasting models that have been used are models in which the volatility is modeled as constant. And we are now working with versions of the model that instead account for volatility changes. Of course, it's kind of difficult because there are a lot. We have a lot of variables, and so you really have to be very parsimonious in these changes in volatility. But the kind of work that Professor Engel has been referring to before are quite useful to to have very parsimonious ways to account for volatility changes. Okay, so do I have still 5 minutes? 5 minutes. So I just wanted to also to shine a light to another kind of important activity that we have in my unit. So this is the production of measures of output gap. Okay, so the idea is that the important, as I was saying before, it is important to know how much of the observed variations in macroeconomic aggregates is due to changes in the cyclical conditions. Okay, so you can always think about and I'll be very quick on this. You can always think about every variable that is relevant to be decomposed in three main components. So you can think about, and this could be GDP, but could be anything. So basically having three components which are, the last component is a measurement error, and we have to take seriously into account the fact that all the data that we use are measured with an error, okay? And so, it's very, very important that we take that into consideration. And I have to say that at the Federal Reserve Board, they are really, really very, very fastidious about this, and they really know the details that which data are generated, and these aspects are crucially taken into consideration in the modeling and analysis phase. Then, beside the measurement error, which is the stuff that you want to ignore, then the rest is basically there are two components. One part is the long-term trend, okay, and then which we could call potential for GDP. Okay? And typically, macroeconomic policy doesn't have much to say about that, or doesn't have much to, there are no tools for influence the long-term, say, the long-term evolution of the variables. But then there's a cycle, and the cycle we know that monetary policy has the mandate to stabilize. Okay? So the idea is that to have models that allow us to, basically distinguish, what is, cycle, what is the output gap in front of data developments, okay? So basically we take signal from a lot of indicators, and most importantly from labor market indicators, which are, are considered very, very useful and very important for assessing the pulse of the economy. And I have to remind here that in the mandate of the Federal Reserve Board is we have a dual mandate. So one is basically price stability, but the second one is also to maintain the employment at the highest possible level. So employment really is very, very important in the mandate of our institution. And labor market variables are really connected with the cycle, and they give a lot of information about the cyclical conditions. So there's obviously we have models in which we build on the relationship between the cycle and labor market variables. With the specification of what they're called Occam's law relationships. So the cyclical part of the labor markets is linked to the cyclical measure of the economy, the output gap. Even if there are some problems because, obviously there are, instabilities, there are also interpretation issues and so on and so forth. But, the labor market variables are really important into that. The other source of information comes from, obviously, nominal variables because, we think about it that the inflation, or at least the cyclical part of inflation, is connected to the output gap. And so we have specifications in terms of what we call Phillips curves. These are also quite problematic because we know that, especially in the last, say 20 years, even more, inflation is becoming progressively very, very difficult to predict. So the signal that we get from nominal variables is a very, very weak signal. But we have specifications with forward-looking expectations and so on and so forth. So as you can, I show you just a visual representation of our output on this front. And so here there is, the output gap evaluation that comes from our models that we take into, that we maintain in the section. So as you can see here, the graph is really censored because, we cannot show these things outside. There is a window of 5 years. And so I've been quite on the safe side, and so I truncated in 2009. And so as you can see, basically there is the judgmental evaluation of the output gap, which is the black line, and then there is this kind of envelope, which gives us the model-based one, which is based on 4 different models. And so you can see basically confidence bands, and also kind of you can see the effect also of the model uncertainty on this. Okay, so we have also so we have also some ongoing research on this front, in particular. So let me just mention one thing which is very important. So especially on the labor market, we are really taking seriously the challenge of having very reliable measurements to be put in the model, in the models. And in particular, you might know that the labor market statistics in the US, but in most countries, they are based on surveys. And so therefore, they are characterized by some uncertainty, some true sampling uncertainty. And at the board, at the moment, we have some very important and very useful projects in which we are trying to get more granular and indicators of the evolution of the labor market by using microdata. And of course, the challenge is to bring to this data to be representative and to add them to the models that we are using. And we are quite excited about the fact that we seem to gain by using this, what we call these unconventional data sources, or sometimes we refer to this as the extended measurement agenda. And we have very, very, very encouraging results about the usefulness of these new sources of data. Sometimes they are referred to as big data, but in reality, these are basically using unconventional data sources. So to wrap up, I just led you through a whistle-stop tour of our portfolio policy tasks, which are basically the nowcasting and short-term forecasting of GDP, the assessment of slack, so the assessment of the output gap, and just focus and attention on the unconventional, our increasing interest and increasing experience on using unconventional data sources. Thanks so much.
Bene, c'è il tempo, come per la prima sessione, per un paio di domande prima dei saluti finali. Se qualcuno volesse fare una domanda ai due relatori.
Hi, a question for Professor Engel. We saw in all of the graph that you show that the last year we have a big rise in the systemic risk. Why? And is it very dangerous?
Yes, well, I kept pointing to that uptick at the end, and I'm not exactly sure what it's about, but it coincides with a lot of this discussion about protectionism, I think. And I think it could be that markets around the world, and particularly bank stocks, may be adversely affected by the possibilities of a trade war. But it could also be other things, and you know, it's sort of hard to tell, but that's, from an economic point of view, that's one I think we could worry about. It could also be a result of the rise of interest rates. The ECB is getting ready to end quantitative easing, and the US is raising interest rates. That increases the volatility of stock prices, and it therefore increases the risk of banks, and the bank stocks, I'm not sure whether they respond in a very predictable way to interest rate rises, since this is both a cost and a benefit for banks. But those are the two kind of main factors I think might be going into this.
Hello. My question is with Sergiani. First of all, when you use GDP new costing, you use some mean average IRMA models for that one. Would you think that mean is biased, and for that forecasting or new costing is always coming as a bias option rather than a covariance like Gauge one? And my second question is that for the third point, like your new ongoing projects, you are using the unconventional data sources. Would you think that it's reliable and valid for future implementations?
Thank you. Let me just answer the second point, because I unfortunately didn't get the first one, but I'm just starting with the second one. So these are, as I said, these unconventional data sources are really very, I think, my opinion, and also the opinion of my management at the board, is that they are very, very useful. And so one particular project that is also quite visible, because it has also been published on our working paper series, is this idea of using payroll data to give an alternative measurement of employment. As I was saying before, so the surveys that measure employment in the US, they are quite limited, so they are finite number of establishments or individuals, in the realms of like 100,000, so, you can think about a lot of uncertainty going on there. And so, whereas with this payroll data set that has been collected, we are talking about like, a lot of information that go in the realm of, say, millions, okay? So of course, I mean, this data, it's like, it's not like finding a gold mine immediately, but so you have, you find you have this data, and you really have to do a lot of cleaning up. Okay, so the cleaning up of the data has to go into two directions. First of all, the first direction is basically to get rid of the unnecessary noisiness of the data itself. There are a lot of because remember that these data are harvested incidentally, so they are not produced by businesses that their main business is produce data. they don't come from statistical agencies that do that, as their daytime job, right? They are collected incidentally. For instance, this payroll data, they are collected by a company that does provide payroll services, right? So, there are a lot of kind of very strange circumstances or kind of features that require us to clean the data, okay? The second thing, to get rid of some noisiness, the second thing is also the issue of representativeness, because, statistical agencies, when they produce the measures, they're really very, they have the mandate to get things that, measures that are based on representative samples. So we really have to do a lot of cleaning up, okay, also, and stratified sampling and all the techniques which are available for doing that. And so gradually, these data are now entering in their utilization phase, and we have found them extremely useful. I'll give you also another example. So, many times I was referring before about these weather events, so there are weather events, and we want to understand, so the particular slowdown, how much of the particular slowdown that we see in certain geographical areas is due to weather disruptions. And now we have data on transactions that allow us to, basically monitor, county by county what's going on. And so this is really very invaluable, really very useful for analysts. But as I said, there is a lot of preparation that has to go through before these things become usable. It's not like finding, nuggets of gold. You really have to clean up a lot. And I would ask you to reformulate the first question because I didn't understand it.
Yeah, sure, I will do it. First, sir, for that question, in your point of view, the limitization of the data because of noise, error factors, make it more valid and more achievable for your future implementation. Is it right?
Yeah,
Am I right?
So I mean, the way in which I understand your question is that, so we have a measure we have a part of the model which is the noise. And this noise is obviously very little predictable and very little significant, of very little significance for making the projection. So we're basically just washing it out.
Okay. My first question is that in GDP new costing, you are using some ARMA models, which is...
No, the ARMA model was only shown that if you take an ARMA model as a kind of like a straw man, okay? And you try to see how much using an ARMA model you can forecast GDP, what you understand is that basically the forecasting, the forecastability is only in the very short run. Okay? We use models which are a little bit more sophisticated, which have a lot of variables.
Okay. Thank you.
Bene, credo possiamo chiudere questo convegno ringraziando nuovamente gli speaker, ma anche tutto il pubblico che ha accorso per questa giornata, direi, straordinaria in ricordo di Franco Modigliani. Ricordando anche, e chiudo, che il materiale sarà presto disponibile delle presentazioni sul sito dell'Istituto I.S.E.O. Grazie ancora.